Chapter 1701, Releasing the Prisoners. After the long-haired man ran around with the joy of gaining his freedom, he cast his gaze at Zen. A hard-to-read look flashed on his face as he said, "No matter who your enemies are, I will kill them." He then looked at the dungeon and let out a laugh. As for the guys in the dungeon, it's better to let them stay there. Hearing this, Zen let out a faint smile. He knew he didn't need to release everyone in the dungeon. If Blade alone was enough to kill Pranav, Mateo, and Marco, there was no need for him to release the rest prisoners from the dungeon. "If you really have the balls to kill the 3 people I just mentioned," Zen said, "then there's no need to release them." He gave a small nod. At first, the people in the dungeon were not willing to take the inner demon oath, but hearing Zen and Blade's conversation brought them to a panic. Previously, Zen had something to ask for them, so he offered to release them. The chance would be long gone at this point. The thought of this brought a lot of anxiousness to the encaged warriors. "Blade, what are you saying? You want to burn the bridges? You ungrateful mongrel, I should have never taught you my cultivation method." "Well, your name is Zen, right? I will swear by my inner demon. I, Master Evil, will listen to your commands in this life. If I disobey in any way or form, I will be attacked by the inner demon and suffer through my own death." Just then, his old voice echoed off the walls of the dungeon. Apart from Master Evil, another person who was called Big Mouth spoke up loudly, "I am also willing to take the oath. I, Wayne Wu, am willing to submit to Zen in this lifetime. If I break my oath, I will be burned by the inner demon and suffer through my own death." Seeing that 2 warriors couldn't wait to take the oath, Blade looked quite defeated at the sight of this. Many years ago, Blade was captured by Bromley and taken captive to the fairy palace. However, Bromley did not imprison him in the depths of the dungeon. Compared to the 3 old freaks in the dungeon, he was deemed unqualified to be locked up in dungeon. However, Blade, who was locked out of the dungeon, had gained a lot of things from Wayne and Master Evil by cheating. If these 2 people were released at the same time, they would definitely find out the truth and take revenge on him, and that was why he had been so against the idea of Zen releasing anyone else from the dungeon just now. "There's no need to release them. I can help you kill those 3 true gods. Even if they are the disciples of a holy being, they shouldn't be my match," Blade advised. I knew you were a swindler. Wait till I come out and tear you apart." As the 2 people heard Blade's words, they were enraged and profanities and cuss words echoed back and forth within the dungeon. "I'll release them. After all, they have already taken the inner demon oath," Zen said. He paused for a moment and then continued on, "I don't care what grievances there are among the 3 of you. Since you've taken the oath, you have to behave before me. As for what you will do after you accomplish the task, that's all up to you." Blade agreed to Zen's suggestion. Compared to the 2 vicious fellows left in the dungeon, he seemed to have a more stable consciousness. If he fell into their hands, he already knew what would come out of this. After all was settled, Zen asked Blade to wait by the side while Zen made his way into the entrance of the gloomy, rotten dungeon. Leading to the entrance of the dungeon were moss-covered steps and liquids dripping from the ceiling. The walls on both sides of the dungeon were also covered with mosses, which moved against the walls as if they were alive. Out of curiosity, he stopped in his tracks to examine them carefully, but once he tried to move forward, a force locked his feet to the ground, leaving him unable to move. Zen was stunned and instantly tried to wriggle his limbs out. However, he came to notice that the mosses on the ground began to motion towards him rapidly and spread like wildfire. They began to wrap around his feet, then ankles, and made their way up to his legs, trapping Zen and gluing him in his place. Seeing this, Zen concentrated a huge dose of strength to his feet. As he heaved his way out of the infesting mosses, he heard someone from a distance. "This moss is unique to the Swirl Forest. You're quite lucky that you have great strength, and that you run fast. If any ordinary true god found themselves here, they'd be dead in a matter of minutes," Master Evil chuckled. The enchanted barrier of the fairy palace enclosed everything from the forest. However, the moss would be one of the exceptional creatures that could escape and make its way around. The simple, adorable plants seemed harmless on the outside. Yet despite their looks, they still contained a terrifying devouring force. Moreover, these things had an extremely strong vitality. Even if someone tried to clear and uproot them, they'd be back within days. Every so often, the true gods in the dungeon would clean out the mosses in the dungeon. Master Evil even used the flames to destroy them around the inside and outside of the dungeon, but the mosses still flourished nonetheless. Who knew moss could be so magical? The Swirl Forest, though, you have mentioned, is that huge forest right outside this fairy palace. This was the first time Zen ever heard the name of this forest, and he soon realized that the fairy palace was actually built in this forest. It might have been that Zen said something that triggered him, because Master Evil pretended not to hear his question and said, "Come in quickly and get us out of here. We'll help you deal with the strong enemies and then we'll never see each other again." The inner demon oath they had taken was something to be taken seriously. They knew they were to follow Zen's orders for the rest of lives. These people were all powerful, renowned warriors of the divine land. For them to willingly follow someone's orders their whole lives was something no one would have guessed. They knew what they were getting into, so they had a plan. After helping Zen kill his enemies, they'd move very far away. It would be best if they never saw Zen again. Seeing that Master Evil didn't want to answer his question, Zen didn't push him further. So he continued on his journey and walked quickly down the stairs. Eventually, he entered a narrow corridor and found that the dungeon wasn't big. There were only 2 cells on this floor and there were bright bars erected around the cells. These bars would have to be made of the same material as the fairy chain, and they were probably here for countless years. Notably, the bars shone brightly. Zen also noticed that there were a lot of potholes on the bars, most likely made by prisoners who wanted to break the bars and escape. Through the bars of the first cell, Zen saw an old man with a head full of silver hair sitting inside. This man had intimidating eyebrows, deep-set eyes, and a pointy hooked nose. The corners of his mouth sagged along with his mustache hanging off the sides. His features were strange, and would have left anyone at a deep confusion upon seeing him. He gave off a strong sense of malice and viciousness. Zen assumed that this person must be Master Evil. Zen sized up the old man, and the old man did the same to Zen. After they gave each other good looks, Master Evil sneered and said, "I have wondered what kind of warrior was chosen by Bromley to be his disciple, but it seems that it is a warrior that has nothing special." Zen ignored him. He simply activated the heaven token and a grey light shot out towards the silver bars in front of him. Crack! The moment the light entered in between the bars, dense cracks started to appear on them. As they collapsed, they disappeared before Zen's eyes. Previously when Zen released Blade, he had been amazed that the material used for the chains was magical because they disappeared and evaporated like water. For some reason, this kind of material could actually imprison true gods. Ding, ding, ding. As Master Evil saw the bars dissipate, he extended out his hands in front of Zen in a plea. "Please." There were 2 fairy chains holding his arms together. After Zen untied the 2 fairy chains binding Master Evil, the latter stretched out his wrists and rubbed them with his palms. A joyful smile then appeared on his face. To gain freedom was indeed something that could make one wild with joy. However, when such smile appeared on Master Evil's sinister face, it was quite uncomfortable to look at. With a flip of his body, Master Evil immediately disappeared in front of Zen. Zen merely felt a gust of wind brush past him, and when he turned his head to look, Master Evil had already rushed out of the dungeon. "Hey, please don't forget me. I'm still locked inside." An anxious voice called from the other cell. Wayne, the big mouth, was imprisoned here together with Master Evil for countless years. When he saw that Master Evil had been freed, he was itching to get out as well. When Zen arrived in front of Wayne's gloomy cell, he couldn't help but let out a laugh. This big mouth really lived up to his name. He had a huge mouth, and his lips were like 2 sausages, making him look very amusing. Chapter 1702, Enslaving. "Do I look funny to you?" Wayne snarled, his ugly face crumpling in malevolence. Since he was not human, it was natural for his appearance to be a bit odd. Unfortunately, he had an incredible amount of pride, so any sort of offense against him was intolerable. "I'm sorry," Zen apologized as he tried to suppress his smile. Even if he was successful in forcing these people to swear the inner demon oath, they were still supreme elders of the divine land. It wouldn't be good for Zen to be rude. Believing the sincerity of Zen's apology, Big Mouth found himself surprised at how easy it was to talk to this young man. After taking such a serious inner demon oath, he could now be considered enslaved by this young man. There was no need for him to have apologized to him. In the divine land, both he and Master Evil were outlaws that were hunted by all forces. All the friends they'd made were naturally vicious, and he often had to fight other people that made fun of his appearance. Of course, almost all true gods that made fun of him were very swiftly eaten by him. This was because Big Mouth cultivated the extremely powerful heaven-devouring technique. After devouring a true god, he did not destroy their cinnabar field, rather he was able to merge his prey's inner world with his own. The more true gods he consumed, the stronger and more terrifying his inner world became. His current strength was only a notch below Master Evil, but the rate at which he improved was definitely faster. As long as he kept devouring true gods, then achieving the consummation of true gods level and becoming a holy being wasn't that far off. To do that though, he needed to devour an unimaginable number of true gods. It was after having devoured thousands that Bromley caught him. Alas, I'm used to this, he muttered with an uncaring wave. Set me free, quickly. If one treated others with respect, then he or she too would be treated the same way. Zen nodded before using the token of heaven to help free this big mouth. As soon as he was set free, he quickly scrambled and ran out of the dungeon. Zen was left in the dust. He turned his gaze and looked deeper into the dungeon once again. There was a big dog in the backyard and then Blade, who was locked out of the dungeon. On the first floor were Master Evil and Big Mouth, Wayne. Zen also remembered hearing another voice, the one that told him he was requiring too much. At the end of the dungeon was a passageway that led downwards. The passageway was largely covered with moss. It was also only large enough for one person to pass through at any given time. A trace of hesitation quickly flashed through Zen's face. There was already a true god in the evolutionary universe, and that was Win. He only needed another 2 true gods to fight with him. He could let 2 of Blade, Master Evil and Big Mouth fight. There was no need for him to release so many people. Moreover, despite being imprisoned in this dungeon, the prisoners seemed to have a few useful abilities such as clearing away the dungeon moss. Zen waited until both Master Evil and Big Mouth swore their inner demon oaths before entering the dungeon. If this fellow on the second floor was not as willing, then he naturally wouldn't go in. This person seemed to be unwilling to speak with him, and Zen really had no initiative to compel a senior to do so. Since he didn't want to cause trouble, he simply turned around and prepared to leave. Just as he took a step, however, a soft voice broke through the darkness. "Young man, I cannot swear the inner demon oath." The young man stopped in his tracks. "Sir, I'm not going to force you, but it's just that my strength is too low to face against you. I have to do this, for the sake of my own safety." Alas, the voice signed faintly. "I understand." If Zen let any of them out without any precautions, then he basically just signed his own death sentence. The second floor was once again plunged into silence for a moment before the voice spoke once again. "Young man, for some reason, I cannot swear the inner demon oath, but there is another way to make you feel at ease." Even if this person was stronger than Master Evil and Big Mouth, anyone would desire freedom. "What is it?" Zen asked. Swish! A green ray of light suddenly shot out from the second floor. This light shot over and landed at Zen's feet. "This is an enslaving token. I'll let you use it on me for the time being. Is this enough?" "Enslaving token?" Zen murmured in astonishment. Compared to the inner demon oath, an enslaving token was much more powerful. The oath only served as a restriction, and Zen could only use it to order them simple, non-life-threatening stuff. However, the oath would fail to hold if the one who made it was forced to do something that was life-threatening. This also meant that they would suffer strong inner demon backlash, which greatly increased their probability of dying. But either way, they would die. If Master Evil or Blade was facing that state, in their anger, they might really kill Zen first before they died. The enslaving token guaranteed full obedience to the bearer. If Zen used it, he would be this mysterious person's absolute master. He even had the power to change this warrior's mood, erase this warrior's memories, or even turn this warrior into a puppet. To be willing to be enslaved like this made Zen even more confused of this person's motives. If you do not believe that this enslaving token is real, then you can let the Fairy Palace's servant check it. Saul has followed Bromley for many years and should be able to recognize this token, the voice said. Zen carefully picked up the green token and walked out of the dungeon. Outside, he quickly handed it over to Saul. The sight of the token rendered Saul speechless. This is an enslaving token, the highest amongst its kind. Anyone, except the holy beings, can be enslaved by this token. The prisoner on the second floor gave you this. Zen nodded in reply. Saul tutted and then smiled. Cunning. What do you mean? Zen asked. There was a period of time when the enslaving token was all the rage in the divine land. In the end, so many creatures grew to hate this thing. They would rather die than be enslaved, Saul narrated. That prisoner who focuses on the cultivation methods regarding the soul cannot swear an oath with the inner demon because that would cause a huge blow to the godly way that prisoner cultivates. Hence, being enslaved by you seems a better option. The prisoner on the second floor had secretly observed Zen. Confident that the young man was neither despicable nor dark, that prisoner willingly handed over the enslaving token in a desperation to attain freedom. That prisoner truly was cunning, as Saul had said. With his suspicions confirmed, Zen took the token back and returned to the dungeon. Under the mysterious prisoner's guidance, Zen sent a thread of his soul force into the token. The moment he linked the token with himself, Zen immediately felt a cold feeling invade his mind as he sensed an unfamiliar, yet powerful soul. It seemed that he could read any thought or memory that this soul had. Zen possessed the will of worlds which allowed him to read the lives of countless creatures, however, he was reading them as a bystander. Right now, Zen had an absolute and unfettered view of this soul's secrets as well as its understanding of cultivation methods and life. There was no resistance and Zen could even erase any memory if he wanted. In short, Zen was now the master of this soul. Can you release me now? The prisoner's faint voice called out once again. Zen nodded. In a flash, he rushed through the narrow moss passageway towards the second floor. The moment he entered, the mossy walls suddenly wrapped around him. Humph! Zen snorted as he began to fight his way forward. According to Master Evil, the moss in the swirl forest could swallow even a true god, but to Zen, this was nothing once he activated the power of the 9 stars. So Zen began his fight against the growth of the thick moss. Chapter 1703, The Woman in Blue. Zen squeezed himself between the walls of the narrow passageway and found that he was on the second floor of the dungeon. However, the scene that unfolded in front of him had left Zen completely dumbstruck. The second floor of the dungeon was vast, and it was about several hundred feet in depth. This was in contrast to the constricted space of the dungeon's first floor. This floor seemed far more spacious. 8 silver discs were mounted on the ceiling, floor, and walls of the dungeon. Each of these discs had a fairy chain attached to it, which extended to the center of the dungeon. At the end of the fairy chains was a person bound in them. The fairy chains were wrapped tightly around the person like a cocoon. There were no discernible features to recognize the person's appearance. Zen noticed countless slender hair strands that stretched out from the gaps between the chains and extended further onto the ground. Is it a woman? Zen thought. Although it was him who enslaved this person by using the enslaving token, he didn't try to explore the memories of the person's soul. When he had heard the voice from the second floor, Zen wasn't able to distinguish if the person who spoke was a man or a woman. An alabaster arm was visible from a small gap between the fairy chains. The arm was pale and slender, as if it was carved out of white jade. It had an elegantly beautiful form. There was a high chance that this hand had thrown the enslaving token to Zen earlier. Is this person's cultivation level too high that it requires so many fairy chains to restrain her? Zen wondered. He advanced towards the cocoon and said, "Let me help you unravel the chains." When he finished speaking, he activated the heaven token again. Cracks riddled the fairy chains and they crumbled before disintegrating, like silk that was reeled off from a cocoon. Little by little, a naked body was revealed in front of Zen. Usually, when a warrior reached a certain level of cultivation, they were expected to have a thorough understanding of physical bodies and how they functioned. Soul Sea Realm warriors lived for thousands of years, and they had seen all kinds of beautiful creatures. As for the higher level warriors, and even true gods, they could live for an even longer period of time. They were no longer amazed by beauty, all creatures were just vessels in their eyes. A true god like Wayne, who cared a lot about his looks, was a rare case. However, Zen was only 40 years old. He still felt a little awkward when an extremely beautiful woman appeared in front of him stark naked. She radiated a glow that was as bright and clear as the moonlight. There seemed to be some kind of enchantment hidden within her body that made it impossible for Zen to look away. But out of respect, Zen still forced his face to one side. After the fairy chains were all removed, rays of soft blue light surrounded the woman's body. These rays of soft light formed bands of light that intertwined with each other and covered the private parts of her body. Soon, the light turned into a simple and conservative blue dress. She floated down slowly, fluttering her long dress. Her slender and well-proportioned legs were visible underneath the dress, as they bent slightly before the soles of her bare feet touched the ground. Only then did Zen dare raise his head to carefully examine the enchanting woman's features. Ever since he had ascended to the upper world, almost all the women he had seen were beauties. As the warriors in the upper world cultivated themselves, it became easy for them to change their appearance at will. All it took them was a thought to maintain their young looks. What differentiated the beauties in the upper world were their individual temperaments. For example, Lavender was enthusiastic under her aloof facade, and Letitia was graceful with her delicate looks. However, the woman in front of Zen gave off a mysterious aura that he couldn't exactly figure out. Humans were creatures with instinctive curiosity. Oftentimes, mystery represented a strong attraction. Saul had mentioned that this woman focused on the cultivation methods regarding the soul. Supposedly, it was because of this that she gave off such a strange aura. "What's your name?" Zen asked. The woman smiled faintly. Each of her movements seemingly exuded a mysterious charm, which caused Zen to be attracted to her involuntarily. It confused him tremendously. You are indeed very righteous. You didn't pry into my memories when you enslaved me. After she was enslaved by Zen, it was equivalent to having exposed everything about herself to him. Zen only needed to look through her memories to know every single tiny thing that had happened in her life. I said that I didn't need to enslave anyone, and I wouldn't pry into your memories, Zen replied. I just need some help and that is what I came here for. It doesn't matter. The woman stepped forward, barefoot, and gracefully approached Zen. Smiling faintly, she extended her slender index finger and caressed Zen's face. I won't tell you my name. If you want to know who I am, go find out for yourself. She wiggled her finger at Zen, and with her thin eyebrows raised slightly, she turned around and walked towards the dungeon's exit. Just a bit earlier, Zen had forced his way to the second floor by clearing large clumps of moss. But the mosses grew too quickly in such a short time that they had already blocked the exit again. When the woman walked towards the clumps of moss, the mosses seemed to be afraid to have contact with her. They scattered all over the area to get out of her way. The mosses on the places on which her feet stepped instantly split to the sides as if they were extremely fearful of touching her. Effortlessly, this woman walked out of this place. As for Zen, he was left standing there in a daze. He only needed to reach her memories with his mind to know her name, but he forcefully refrained from doing so. He felt that it was some sort of a trap for him if he searched her soul. Although it was very tempting, he didn't want to risk it. After the woman in blue left, the moss grew again, layers upon layers, and covered the entire passageway to the exit. As he looked at the constantly wriggling moss, Zen frowned. He could only circulate the strength source within his inner world and use it to forcefully squeeze his way through the thick moss to get out of this place. As soon as Zen made his way out of the dungeon, he heard the sound of a dog barking from outside. Wayne was apparently teasing Blackie from a distance. Bound by the fairy chain, Blackie could only bark crazily at Wayne but could not fight back at him. Blackie's barks were able to suppress Zen's soul greatly, but they had no effect on Wayne. When the woman in blue appeared in front of Wayne, it was as if he had seen something extremely terrifying. His sausage-like lips couldn't help but twitch uncontrollably, but they had stopped moving immediately after a moment. Blackie also whimpered fearfully and rushed back into the doghouse, lying motionlessly on the ground. Such a usually ferocious dog was actually looking at the blue-garbed girl with pitiful eyes. Both Master Evil and Blade looked nervous. They didn't expect that Zen would dare to release this woman. Why are you looking at me like that? The blue-clothed woman swept her gaze over all of them, and a mysterious smile appeared on her face. Her smile was so mesmerizing that Zen wondered what these people were so afraid of. You, please don't kill us. Master Evil, who had always had a vicious look on his face, pointed at the blue-robed woman. It was an unusual sight to see such a frightened expression on his face. The blue-clothed woman chuckled. We are all on the same boat now. There is no need to kill you. But I'm not sure that I will not kill you in the future if we meet again. Right now, I think we should talk about how to help this young man. As they got down to discuss the matter at hand, Zen's gaze wavered slightly. 2 people. I only need 2 people to fight with me. Can't we all go together? Blade asked immediately. I agree. If all of us go, we could quickly tear them apart and finish the job as soon as possible, Wayne echoed. They thought that if the blue-clothed woman stayed in the fairy palace, the others who hadn't been chosen by Zen would probably be in great trouble. If the 4 of them went with Zen, at least this blue-clothed woman wouldn't be able to act rashly. It seemed that their fear of her had already reached its peak. No, Zen shook his head. I need you to fight in the universe. The enemy only has 3 true gods on their side, and we can only have 3 on ours. This is a rule. Universe. Are you talking about an inner world built by a holy being? Isn't there only one true god allowed to stay in a universe? Who did Murphy wage a war against? The 4 of them all had surprised looks on their faces. They were imprisoned in the fairy palace, so they were sure that this was the Swirl Forest. They didn't expect that Zen would take them to the universe to fight. Before this, they already knew that they would be fighting against warriors who were Murphy's disciples. Since they were going to fight in some universe, Murphy must have launched a new war against another holy being. Does the person that Murphy waged a war against have the surname Luo? A devious smile appeared on the woman's face as she asked. With this remark, the few true gods instantly found the answer. Chapter 1704, An Urgent Situation. The Divine Land possessed a long history. The time span of a single divine era was unimaginably long. Since the establishment of the divine land, numberless divine eras had flowed into history. In every divine era, there were countless living beings that became true gods. And after becoming a true god, their inner worlds would form a perfect closed loop. Their lifespan was unlimited, which normally meant eternal existence for all of these beings. True gods continued to be born, but only a few had died. As each of the countless divine eras passed, the number of true gods in the divine land began to form an extremely large group. However, the number of true gods that were able to become holy beings was extremely small. Mike Luo was the only one with the surname, Luo. When these true gods heard her speak, they instantly understood what the blue-robed woman meant. They had heard that Holy Mike and Holy Bromley were friendly with each other, so even though there was quite a commotion in the Hall of Holy Beings in the Divine Land, Holy Bromley still remained firmly on Mike's side, resisting the pressure placed upon him. This Zen must be the son of Mike. Then it was no surprise that he had been able to take Bromley as his master. Master Evil and Wayne had sensed Zen's talent and had considered taking him in as a disciple. They abandoned the idea while they heard that Zen was Bromley's disciple. Now that they knew he was the son of Mike, they understood that they were overthinking things. Well, I really did not see that coming, Master Evil grimaced. Wayne standing beside him nodded his head in agreement. At most, he would simply run away after killing 3 of Murphy's disciples. The divine land was vast and boundless, so although Murphy was a holy being and had access to the highest authorities, it would still be difficult for him to learn the truth about what had really happened. However, the war between 2 universes had begun within the inner world of a holy being. Murphy was not the only one who was watching this war with interest. The Hall of Holy Beings were also monitoring the situation closely. At the start the 2 of them had been very active, but now they had begun to retreat. I will go, Blade spoke calmly. Ah, Blade is eminently suitable, he has a highly esteemed status. And he is not afraid that Murphy will take revenge on him. Then, thank you for being so willing to take on this task. The face of Master Evil was beaming while he spoke. Blade rolled his eyes. He had a very different background compared to these 2. The 2 of them were both known as infamous villains in the Divine Land. If they were exposed, they would be haunted by many people. Even if Murphy did not act against them, other holy beings might be inclined to kill them. However, Bromley held Blade here for different reasons, so he was not afraid of Murphy. Then I will also go. The blue-robed woman smiled slightly. Compared to the 2 of them, she didn't display any reluctance. Her alluring eyes revealed a faint black fog that escaped along her eyelashes as if it had left a black eye shadow on her eyelids. All right, Zen said as he nodded his agreement. He was unconcerned who accompanied him as long as he was able to solve this problem without delay. At this, Master Evil and Wayne remained behind in the fairy palace, while Blade and the blue-robed woman followed Zen out of the fairy palace, heading for the battlefield in the evolutionary universe. Roar! A demonic red dragon breath soared into the sky. The dragon breath was like a dam burst, turning half of the sky a deep crimson red. A figure traveled back and forth in the dragon breath. With a leap, he arrived above the head of the ancestral dragon and stepped down lightly onto its head. Boom! An unseen force pressed down, and the giant head of the ancestral dragon was forced downwards hard. This young fellow is truly amazing, but unfortunately it's still too young, Pranav spoke quietly. He had been trapped within the bamboo forests by Supreme Lord of Original Sin, but he had not expected to encounter the ancestral dragon after expending a great deal of effort to unravel the maze array. Boom! That head was heavily trampled into the ground of a supreme world, and had sunk down deeply. It directly drilled through that supreme world. Roar! 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 Pranav had just stepped on the ancestral dragon and the 9 different colored genuine dragons next to him began to shine. They also spewed out different kinds of dragon breath including acid fog, flames, and lightning and so on. You are far more useless than that. Pranav's lips curled up and his body rapidly spun in the air. A soft light was emitted from his body as he unexpectedly withstood the full force of the dragon breath. When he charged towards the 5-clawed golden dragon, he extended his hand and clutched at the air. A giant, light yellow hand grabbed a tender spot of the 5-clawed golden dragon. He then began to exert force. Crack, crack, crack. The 5-clawed golden dragon was instantly crushed into 2 pieces. However, in the instant his body was broken, the broken section of the 5-clawed golden dragon began glowing with a bright light. It appeared like flowing heavenly essence. It ran like mercury, and the 2 broken parts reconnected to restore the dragon. The 9 bodies of the 9 genuine dragons were heavenly bodies. Although the heavenly bodies weren't as strong as the original bodies, they were still extremely difficult to destroy. These heavenly bodies had been damaged on dozens of occasions, yet they repaired themselves again and again. However, if these bodies continued to collapse and the heavenly essence weakened beyond a certain point, it would be difficult to reconstruct the bodies. Now that they couldn't do anything to Pranav, they were naturally in a bad situation. On the other side, Supreme Lord of Oracle and Lavender moved back and forth. They appeared almost like two comets in the sky as they circled around Marco. Wow, I never thought that a human girl could possess such a temperament. I, Marco, am deeply honored to have two such beautiful companions. Marco narrowed his eyes as he held up the soul-searching flag. His eyes were locked firmly onto the two girls. Shut up. With the assistance of Supreme Lord Helm, the bone wings on Lavender's back flapped and she suddenly appeared next to Marco. Her eyes took on a red appearance as her whole body was shrouded in dark red fog. The faith energy she had accumulated from the pool of faith for numberless years was now swarming into the saint-killing spear. Whoosh! This strike held a terrifying determination to kill. Under the condensing of the spear intent, it seemed as if it could pierce straight through everything. The faith energy of killing. I like it. Marco smiled. He didn't attempt to dodge. Instead, he pressed his hand on Lavender's saint-killing spear. At the same time, Supreme Lord of Oracle appeared behind Marco. She looked like a shadow as she traveled through space. The dim light in her hand silently swept relentlessly towards the back of Marco's neck. A trace of excitement could be seen on the beautiful face of Supreme Lord of Oracle. At this distance, she had never failed. However, right at this moment, a strong sense of danger struck Supreme Lord of Oracle's heart. A gray trajectory suddenly appeared. It struck Supreme Lord of Oracle's mind, leaving her with no time to evade it. She felt only a wave of dizziness before she lost consciousness, falling down from the sky. The flash bat's speed was unimaginably fast. Previously, it had killed Supreme Lord of Thunder Punishment in a single hit, but it had only knocked out Supreme Lord of Oracle. Naturally, it was Marco who showed mercy to her. At this time, Marco had already grabbed Lavender's saint-killing spear. With a tug, the saint-killing spear flew out of Lavender's hands like an arrow into the vast space. Seeing this, Lavender wanted to spread her wings and escape, but this was also the time that Supreme Lord Helm wanted to pull back Lavender. Marco's eyes flashed and he casually patted as he sealed Lavender's space. He extended his hand over Lavender's shoulder and grabbed her suddenly. In an instant he crushed the bone wings on Lavender's back and shook the soul-searching flag again. A gray belt of light appeared from inside the flag and swiftly encompassed Lavender. The moment Lavender became entangled by the light, she felt her soul unable to move. Even her speed of thought greatly slowed down, and she was unable to control her body to make an escape. Such a beauty, it would be a shame if she died. Marco chuckled before falling backwards. With the soul-searching flag in his hand, he shot downwards. Supreme Lord of Oracle was falling while unconscious, and she was caught up by Marco after a little while. As Marco shook the soul-searching flag, a grey light belt once again appeared from the flag and wrapped around Supreme Lord of Oracle, holding her tightly. Marco hung the two girls from the soul-searching flag just as if they were spoils of war. As for Lavender and Supreme Lord of Oracle who was now waking, by this point, their mood had already sunk to rock bottom. It was better to die fighting in the universe than be captured by a person who acted in such a way. Wow, Marco's face had a dirty expression as he reached out his hand and gently pinched the face of Supreme Lord of Oracle. Supreme Lord of Oracle could not move, but she continued to stare into Marco. Her cold eyes were filled with burning desire to kill. I like the expression in your eyes. Marco patted the face of Supreme Lord of Oracle. Then, he glanced to the side to see Lavender. Although the two women both wore cold expressions, their auras were as different as the sky and the earth. He was about to play around but just then he suddenly heard the whistling of the wind behind him. His heart froze and he pulled the soul-searching flag as he rushed to the side. Whoosh! A sword light sent from several hundred miles away slashed Marco from the side. The sharpness of this sword light actually chilled Marco's heart. If it had not been for his sharp reactions, this strike might actually have killed him. A few hundred miles away, Zen held his great weighty sword as he stared at Lavender and Supreme Lord of Oracle, who were hanging on the soul-searching flag. The veins on his temples were exposed while his face was filled with a malicious aura. Chapter 1705, A War God. Out of nowhere, Marco saw Zen appear in this place. He jostled slightly with surprise as he exclaimed, "What? Aren't you the boy that Pranav was looking for earlier? Where did you go, and how have you managed to reappear?" Moments before, Pranav had used Marco's soul-searching flag in order to search for Zen's figure throughout the whole evolutionary universe. However, Zen had disappeared without leaving a trace. This was strange, and everyone had felt quite uneasy about such an occurrence. But Zen was now standing right before Marco's eyes. Marco felt utter shock. Still though, despite his curiosity and his questions, he didn't take Zen very seriously. From Marco's perspective, Zen was an ordinary godly genius who just happened to be slightly stronger than the others. If he wasn't bothered in the slightest by the many supreme lords of the evolutionary universe, then there was no way a godly genius, who was only at the world lord's level, was going to intimidate him. He was nothing in his eyes. In Marco's opinion, Zen's reappearance here was no different than courting death. Thank goodness, you've finally shown up on your own. Pranav is stubbornly persistent. He will fight to the end just to find you, and if he doesn't, he'll be talking about this for the next tens of thousands of years to come. Marco whined. Zen did nothing but stare coldly back at Marco. After Marco finished speaking, Zen ordered, "Kill him. Use the most painful method possible." His tone was completely flat and without any emotion whatsoever. Marco's face suddenly became astonished. "Who are you talking to? Wait, have you managed to get yourself a helping hand?" As the true gods of the divine land, no one ever considered a secondary creature as anything, let alone worthy of something. The true gods' identities as Murphy's disciples made them even prouder and more arrogant. Although he couldn't take his question back, the fact remained that Marco had never thought Zen would really find a powerful helper. Before Zen could answer his question, a calm voice suddenly came from behind Marco. "Congratulations, you got that right." Boom. Abruptly, an overwhelming fighting intent began to rise. This man's fighting intent contained an invincible might. It was as if he feared absolutely nothing in the world. Even if his life was directly on the line, he wouldn't hesitate in charging forward, not even for a second. Upon feeling the overwhelming fighting intent, Marco immediately knew that he had encountered great trouble. Although his frivolous and playful personality often took precedence, Marco's talent was undoubtedly excellent. This was true because otherwise, he would never have been taken in by Murphy as his disciple. As soon as he felt the fighting intent, his right hand started to shake, and the flash bat that was perched on the soul-searching flag instantly turned into a gray light as it charged toward the person behind him. The flash bat's speed was so tremendous that it could barely be seen by the naked eye. Some moments earlier, even Supreme Lord of Thunder Punishment and the others had been completely unable to catch a genuine glimpse of it. All they could see was a gray flash. The person who had appeared behind Marco reached out his hand in an instant and opened it fiercely. As though he were catching a baseball, the gray flash stopped in his hand. Although the flash bat continued struggling violently, it was unable to break free from his grasp. "Oh, it's a flash bat. Such a rare creature. What a pity to have to kill it." The man revealed a sly smile and then squeezed his hand forcefully, causing the flash bat's soul to instantly dissipate. Generally speaking, the flash bat wasn't very powerful, and its soul was usually considered as extremely fragile. Due to its very high speeds though, even ordinary true gods would have their fair share of difficulties tracking it, let alone killing it. For Blade, this was far from challenging. How dare you kill my flash bat?" Marco's eyes widened with astonishment and anger. He might not have caught the flash bat by himself, but he had always regarded it as a precious treasure. He falsely believed that no one in this universe would have the capacity to catch it, and he had thus sent it out confidently. It had never crossed his mind that he'd have to face this man, who had suddenly appeared, and had a strength that far exceeded his imagination. Such a strong fighting intent. "Are you a member of the War God Hall?" Marco gritted his teeth as he asked his question. Blade shrugged his shoulders. "I won't deny it." As he spoke, his fighting intent grew even stronger. Once he entered the battlefield, he became extremely excited. His senses heightened and he felt ready to attack at any moment. Marco kept his guard up and said, "I am Murphy's disciple," in a cold, unwelcoming voice. "I know," Blade replied flatly. "This is a universal war between two holy beings. My master is watching us right now," Marco exclaimed. "I know," Blade replied anew. "Do you know the price to pay for meddling in this matter?" Marco asked again. "I know," Blade shouted ferociously this time. "Then why don't you get the heck out of here?" Marco shouted. Blade revealed a faint smile and as he stared directly into Marco's eyes, his eyes filled with pity. "I know the significance of all this, yet I'm still determined to intervene in this matter." Once he finished speaking, he took a step into the air. Boom! A dull sound exploded from beneath Blade's feet. Here, in this universe, the space was far less condensed than that of the divine land. With a single step from this powerful man, the space instantly collapsed under the great pressure. So much so that it even formed an annihilating force that equally exploded in the air, spreading to the vast space beneath Blade's feet. This was just the power of a single step. As Zen watched the powerful destructive force erupt forth, he could do nothing but sigh in absolute awe. From his perspective, Blade seemed just too powerful. Although Zen had 1/3 of a holy being's strength source at hand, he still hadn't been able to fully utilize it. This was because his cultivation level was still too low, and his control over his strength wasn't so great just yet. This, though, wasn't necessarily Zen's fault. It was like giving a knife to a 3- or 4-year-old child. No matter how smart the child was, it would still be difficult for them to fully display the knife's power. Thus, even though Zen possessed physical strength that far exceeded that of Blade, he was still no match to him. That was, if he were to fight Blade with merely his physical strength alone. Marco was already on full guard against Blade's movements. Upon hearing Blade's reply, his face darkened and he threatened, "My master could crush you into muddy flesh in the blink of an eye. Don't you fear death?" "Humph," was all that could be heard in reply. A cold smile appeared on Blade's face. In the air above, he continued rushing forward at an extremely fast speed. Every step he took caused a vast space to collapse beneath him and released an intense destructive force. As Marco watched him approach, frozen in stance, his eyes narrowed in nervousness. Should he choose to fight or to flee? Even if he chose to escape, Blade would catch him in an instant. At that moment, Marco realized he could no longer hesitate and he shook the soul-searching flag in his hand. Several true god souls flew out from the soul-searching flag, one by one. There were only 7 true god souls within the soul-searching flag, and each of them had been refined using a secret soul technique over countless years. They were the soul-searching flag's trump cards, so to speak. Prior to right now, Marco never imagined that he would have to make use of the true god souls. In fact, he had only used the flash bat in an attempt to warn the supreme lords of the evolutionary universe. Seeing the results of his eye-opener though, he was worried about whether or not these 7 true god souls were enough to protect him. The 7 true god souls each had their own unique characteristics. They were respectively an armored general, an elder with long whiskers, a woman, a true spirit. There were others, too. Needless to say, they had all been very powerful creatures when they were still alive. Most powerful warriors were unwilling to see their souls enslaved and driven by others. Prior to such an enslavement, many would think of and attempt ways to destroy their own souls. In other words, capturing a true god soul wasn't set out to be an easy task. Once someone succeeded in doing so though, it was a formidable and rare skill. Although Master Evil and Wayne were much stronger than Blade, dealing with these powerful souls might actually prove to be a challenge for them while it was much easier for Blade. The main reason for the latter was because Blade was from the War God Hall. The warriors of the War God Hall specialized in the fighting godly way. Once their fighting intent was activated, it became completely unstoppable. Even their souls would be surrounded by the raging fighting intent and thus, they wouldn't even fear soul-level attacks. When the first true god soul rushed over to him, Blade immediately punched it head-on. His fist was filled with fighting intent as it smashed into the void. The space, tens of thousands of feet wide, immediately exploded, and everything within it began to dissipate. Boom! Once the glaring light that was produced by the annihilation disappeared, the first true god soul was gone, nowhere to be seen. It had already been destroyed and had disappeared. Blade didn't stop there, though. His second punch was loaded and he launched it without a moment's hesitation. Boom, boom, boom. Every time a dull sound reverberated, a vast expanse of space was ultimately demolished, leaving nothing more but dust behind. Simultaneously, a true god soul was also destroyed. It was then that Marco's heart sank in despair. Each of these true god souls were legitimate enough to serve as his trump card, but they couldn't even withstand a single blow from this man. He wondered how Zen had managed to find such a powerful helping hand. When Supreme Lord of Oracle and Lavender, who were bound to the soul-searching flag, watched the scene play out before them, their eyes widened in astonishment. They stared at the man who looked like a war god, and both their expressions were filled with disbelief. And at the same time, they shared the same thoughts that Marco was having. Where had Zen found such a powerful warrior who was actually willing to help him? Chapter 1706, Fighting Intent Penalty. Lavender appeared to be thinking of something. She knew Zen better than Supreme Lord of Oracle did, and she had also stayed in that fairy palace for a very long time. When Zen traveled to the illusion battlefield, Lavender had often walked around the fairy palace, aimlessly and alone. The fairy palace still had many secrets that had yet to be revealed. Occasionally, from the palace, she could hear the barking of a dog. Although Lavender had never seen Blackie before, the power contained in Blackie's roar had left a deep impression on her, who at the time, was still a soul body. Although she was fearless, when Blackie barked, the sound caused her to feel a lot of pressure, even if the distance between them was far too great. She guessed that Blade must have come from the fairy palace. Once Blade had successfully destroyed the true god souls one by one, he gradually slowed his speed and leisurely walked toward Marco. His long black hair draped messily over Blade's shoulders, and his muscles were bulging, which made his body look as though it had been embedded with stones. His muscles even appeared to emit a faint glow, as if there was some kind of special power hidden within that was just waiting for the right moment to erupt. Once Marco, who was grabbing the soul-searching flag, noticed Blade, his face finally revealed a hint of fear. He had already understood that the person before him didn't take him seriously at all and was even not afraid of his master. Perhaps Murphy was watching the ongoing battle in this universe, but he would never act rashly. Starting a war in the universe was not a small matter and definitely not something to be scoffed at. It required the Hall of Holy Beings' approval. Aside from Murphy, in fact, many other holy beings were equally paying attention to the war. It was genuinely impossible for Murphy to openly violate the Hall of Holy Beings' rules by taking part in the war personally. In other words, under the attack of this random guy from the War God Hall, no one was permitted to help Marco resist. Many true gods had peacefully lived for an extremely long period of time. According to the calendar in the evolutionary universe, their lifespan could reach tens of billions of years, or even hundreds of billions of years. In the divine land, there were even a few true gods who had committed suicide because they had lived far too long a life and couldn't continue doing so anymore. Marco, on the other hand, was still an extremely young, remarkable true god. He still had an endless amount of longevity to enjoy. He could experience the endless cycle of reincarnation and enjoy the worship of billions of creatures. Until this very moment, he had never thought he could die in the evolutionary universe. He never imagined it would be possible. Right then, as he was out of the fear of death, Marco's only desire was to flee. There was only one place left to which he could escape, and that was the Murphy universe. Although both universes were each fighting their own wars, and it wasn't safe even if he did escape back to the Murphy universe, his master was still the ruler there and he was capable of setting up a strong enough barrier in the Murphy universe in order to protect Marco's life. The moment this thought crossed his mind, his body began to flicker with a blazing white light, and he seemed to transform into a human silhouette before he started to disappear. Humph! Blade let out a grunt as the corner of his mouth curled up slightly. He suddenly raised an arm that was as heavy and weighted as a bucket of water, and threw a punch up toward the sky. Boom! As a muffled sound echoed out, another space suddenly exploded and Marco's body staggered out from the void. Blood dripped from the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were brimming with resentment. Blade's punch was exactly the same as the bite used by the ancestral dragon in order to thrust the Demon Knight Supreme Lord Corbin out of the space passageway. It had extreme power, to say the least. While the ancestral dragon relied on the space comprehension in order to stop Supreme Lord Corbin, who employed the grand teleportation technique, Blade used the shocking speed and precise perception to directly destroy Marco's use of the grand teleportation technique. Moreover, Marco was a true god, and his grand teleportation technique was 100 times more difficult than a Supreme Lord's. Upon catching Marco's gaze, Blade revealed a mocking expression. "Use the most painful method," he uttered. At the end of his sentence, all the muscles in his body doubled in size. The dim light shone even brighter from his arms, chest, and from even between his legs. "Those are the 8-path platforms," Zen said faintly. When he saw the dim light, his eyes flashed. There was more than one way for body refining in the divine land, and making use of the 8-path platforms or the night divine stars to refine the body was common. The method that Blade used was similar to Zen's. Boom! With yet another muffled sound, Blade disappeared from where he was standing and instantly closed in on Marco. Marco became very clear on the idea that he was on the brink of death. After abandoning the soul-searching flag, he suddenly twisted his body in midair, trying his best to avoid Blade's attack. "Pranav, Mateo, come save me," he shouted simultaneously. In this evolutionary universe, the only warriors who could truly help him now were Pranav and Mateo. Marco, on the other hand, had this lingering feeling that Pranav and Mateo might not be able to defeat Blade. As he roared for help though, Blade's large hand landed on Marco's neck, grabbing him and squeezing hard. Blade was 3 times his usual size, and Marco looked like a skinny dwarf in comparison. "The War God Hall has a punishment, known as the fighting intent penalty," Blade said, as he stared at Marco. Marco had obviously heard of this punishment before. His pupils rapidly contracted as the fear on his face grew more obvious. "How dare you to treat me like this? I hope you know you'll regret it," he shouted. Before he could even finish speaking, an endless fighting intent surged from Blade's body. Every true god had their own momentum, and the momentum of the members from the War God Hall was their fighting intent. Suddenly, streaks of fighting intent erupted from Blade's body and pierced straight into Marco's mind, like hundreds of tiny, incredibly sharp knives. The redness on Marco's face immediately vanished, leaving nothing behind. He gritted his teeth as sweat began to pour from all pores on his body. Of course, the worst punishments were always aimed at the soul. Every time a streak of fighting intent drilled into Marco's mind, it broke apart his soul. When a true god's soul was directly attacked, it caused the most intense and true pain. In 3 seconds, Marco's soul had already been sliced by the sharp fighting intent thousands of times. This fighting intent penalties cutting method was extremely precise. In fact, it knew exactly how to keep its opponent suffering for as long as possible, by keeping the soul alive. A few seconds ago, Zen told Blade to use the most painful method possible in order to end Marco's life. Blade suddenly remembered the cruel method that had been used in the War God Hall. Zen, Lavender and Supreme Lord of Oracle were now looking straight at an extremely terrifying face. Marco's distorted face was filled with great pain. There was a burning desire in his eyes to die as soon as possible. This still remained punishment. Despite the fact that Marco looked really bad, there was no way Blade would end his life that quickly. This painful process lasted for another full 90 seconds. After Marco had been cut for tens of thousands of times more, his pupils had expanded and reached their absolute limit. He slowly, but gradually died, as he trembled and shook like a leaf in the wind. Blade casually tossed Marco's body aside with a snort and turned to look at Zen. "Are you satisfied now?" he asked flatly. Zen only nodded his head. Although he believed that Blade was more powerful than Marco, he didn't expect the entire process to have been so simple for Blade. In the end, he had once again underestimated the group of people living in the dungeon. Whoosh! Zen's figure flashed, and he instantly moved to the soul-searching flag's side. Lavender and Supreme Lord of Oracle were both still trapped in bands of light, motionlessly bound to the flag itself. At the moment, he grabbed the soul-searching flag and felt a powerful repulsive force coming at him. His head felt like it had been ripped open and the pain was unbearable. Although Lavender couldn't move or speak, her face displayed pure worry. Her eyes looked lost. The soul-searching flag is not an ordinary supreme primordial weapon. Although I destroyed 7 true god souls, there are still tens of thousands of souls trapped within. Blade stepped forward and stretched out his hand in order to grab onto the soul-searching flag. With a sudden shake, the 2 light bands binding Lavender and Supreme Lord of Oracle broke like chains, and the 2 women instantly regained their freedom. After completely getting rid of the light bands, Supreme Lord of Oracle lightly tapped her foot on the ground before cupping her hands and bowing towards Blade. "Thank you for saving my life," she praised. Blade faintly smiled. "You'd be better off thanking him. I've only come on his orders. I had no intentions of helping you. There was no right or wrong in this universal war." Although he chose to help Zen, this didn't automatically mean that he chose to take a stand. Blade had been imprisoned in the fairy palace by Bromley for a long time, and he didn't know what position the War God Hall had taken toward the 2 holy beings. In such a case, he was even less likely to position himself on one side or the other. When all was said and done, Blade tossed the soul-searching flag to Zen. "This thing is also an extremely powerful treasure. I've already erased the imprint on it. It'll be of great use to you." Chapter 1707, The Battle. The soul-searching flag had once been Murphy's most precious treasure. However, after he became a holy being, this sort of treasure was of no value to him. Therefore, he passed it on to his favorite disciples. The soul-searching flag had passed through several pairs of hands before it had reached Marco's. Not only could the flag capture souls, but it could also imprison them within and constantly refine them. In time, the souls would be enslaved. Besides all of this, the flag could also amplify the perception. Once Blade had erased the soul mark on the flag, Zen was finally able to easily hold it in his hand. The flag was a soul-related supreme primordial weapon, and was highly valuable to Zen. After expressing his thanks, he stored it safely in his space ring. At that moment, an awesome roar could be heard resounding from the mist in the depths of the Divine Land. "Woodruff Zahn, why did a member of your War God Hall appear in the evolutionary universe? And he actually killed my beloved disciple. Get him to leave at once." Naturally, the one who had been roaring was Murphy. In his eyes, the defeat of the evolutionary universe was already an established fact. He wasn't the only one who thought like that. The holy beings in the Hall of Holy Beings had also come to the same conclusion. The living beings in the evolutionary universe were clinging to life with their last breaths. They had no chance of survival unless Mike could come back to life overnight and save the evolutionary universe. While the holy beings were silently watching the war in the universe unfold, another true god had suddenly appeared. The moment Blade appeared, the holy beings knew instantly where he came from. The person who suddenly appeared had to be from the War God Hall. The War God Hall was one of the several great powers within the Divine Land. Moreover, 3 holy beings from the War God Hall had joined the Hall of Holy Beings. In strength, they far exceeded Murphy. Ha ha ha, a hearty laugh rang from the clouds. Blade is alive, a hint of ecstasy could be detected in the voice. Woodruff, I require an explanation from you. What do you mean? Murphy's voice turned cold. An explanation? Murphy, you altered the rules written on the stone slab, which is entirely unacceptable. You know that the reason that we set up the Hall of Holy Beings is to restrain each other, so that we can follow the rules. Did my clansmen break the rules by entering the evolutionary universe? Woodruff laughed without humor. Of course not. According to the rules set out on the stone slab, the evolutionary universe is permitted to send 3 true gods, the voice of Holy J replied. If so, why should Blade retreat? Just because of your words? Or because your head is larger than mine? Ha 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 ha. Once again Woodruff laughed maniacally. The people of the War God Hall had always acted with arrogance, and Woodruff was the leader of the group. How could he be willing to demonstrate weakness to Murphy? The truth was that the holy beings had already seen through the Divine Land, and their words usually didn't come with such a strong smell of gunpowder. However, Blade had a particularly unique effect on the War God Hall, so understandably, Woodruff did all that he could to protect him. As Woodruff retorted, Murphy forced himself to calm down. There was no certainty that the Murphy universe would lose to Blade. After all, they still possessed Mateo. Thus, the depths of the Divine Land returned to tranquility, but the holy beings were left pondering in their hearts. Some of them were convinced that Mike wasn't fated to die, while others of them were abnormally angry. At the start, they had been quite certain of their victory, but the sudden change had made them worried. By this time, the ancestral dragon was riddled with wounds. Most of the beautiful scales on its body had peeled off, and half of its tail had been severed. Even the sword-like horns on its head were now missing. However, it still displayed an extremely strong vitality. Every time it was smashed down by Pranav, it would climb up again. Even though it was deeply wounded, it refused to cower. Marco's panicked voice was not able to reach this place. Pranav didn't believe that there was anything in the evolutionary universe capable of threatening Marco. You're continuing to struggle. An expression of malevolence appeared on Pranav's face. The 9 dragons and the ancestral dragon were truly tenacious. They would never willingly give up. However, the ancestral dragon was now like a spent arrow, and Pranav was planning to end its life. 6-clawed dragons were incredibly rare in the Divine Land, but since the ancestral dragon had already fully grown, he couldn't subdue it as his spiritual pet or contractual beast. His only choice was to kill it first, and then crush those annoying dragons later. Roar! The ancestral dragon, which was crawling above the supreme world, raised its head. It seemed to lack the strength to fly, so it could only prostrate on the ground and breathe towards Pranav. However, its demonic red breath had weakened, so it had already lost its threat and disappeared before it got close to Pranav. Pranav again leapt towards the ancestral dragon. In his hand was the ghost head halberd. As he waved the halberd, a dark red light was emitted from the eyes of the ghost head. The ghost head halberd was also a supreme primordial weapon, and a treasure that was connected to its owner. After easily avoiding the weakened breath of the ancestral dragon several times, Pranav once again stood on its head and raised the ghost head halberd high into the air. Stop! Roar! 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 The 2 nearest genuine dragons rushed over at the same time. The 9 dragons' heavenly bodies had already been repeatedly destroyed, so their surface colors were now much dimmer. Every time their heavenly bodies were destroyed, the recovery speed was slower. The other 7 dragons' heavenly bodies were slowly recovering, and only the 5-clawed golden dragon and the cyan dragon were able to move. Facing the 2 massive bodies, Pranav suddenly turned the halberd in his hand and directed 2 killing forces towards the 2 dragons. The moment the forces touched the dragons' heavenly bodies, they were completely destroyed, turning into countless bits of heavenly essence that scattered everywhere. Once the heavenly essence landed on the ground, it gathered itself towards one location, but it would take a long time for the whole body to condense together once again. Roar! Seeing this scene unfolding, the ancestral dragon raised its head furiously to hold Pranav up. Pranav stood on the head of the ancestral dragon and stabilized his body. After snorting coldly, he stomped on the head of the ancestral dragon. Boom! The ancestral dragon's gigantic head was once again smashed to the ground. Now the ancestral dragon had finally lost its strength. It tried its best to raise up its head. However, no matter how many times it struggled, it was in vain. Its pair of large eyes were filled with sorrow, and it could only continuously whimper. Pranav turned the ghost head halberd slightly and aimed the tip at the ancestral dragon. A circle of red light spread out from the ghost head. He was condensing a strange power. No matter how tenacious the vitality of the ancestral dragon might be, it would not be able to withstand the damage caused by the halberd. Go to perdition, I really don't have the time to fight with you anymore. Pranav had been trapped by the treasure of Supreme Lord of Original Sin earlier and had then been fighting with the 9 dragons and the ancestral dragon for a long while. He had certainly wasted a great deal of time. As he finished speaking, he stabbed the ghost head halberd into the head of the ancestral dragon. But just as the halberd was about to touch the ancestral dragon's head, a bronze fist, larger in size than Pranav's head, suddenly appeared in front of him. With this bronze-colored fist coming at him, he no longer had sufficient time to kill the ancestral dragon. He instinctively placed the ghost head halberd horizontally in front of him. Boom! With the impact of the first punch, his ghost head halberd had been bent from the middle. Seeing that his supreme primordial weapon had suffered such damage from a single punch, he felt a chill growing in his heart. Thump! Almost immediately, the second punch landed on the ghost head halberd. With this blow, the halberd became even more bent. Thump! When the third punch smashed down, the halberd broke apart, and that massive fist smashed into Pranav's chest. Puff! These 3 punches seemed insignificant, but they contained an unimaginable power. Pranav spat out blood, and his whole body flew backwards, leaving a long, thin line of blood trailing behind it. Despite the impact, he wasn't dead. He was sure that these 3 punches could have killed him. It was just that their strength had weakened at the last moment. The attacker must have deliberately suppressed it. Now he was facing a very strong enemy, but it seemed like his enemy intended to spare his life. What was his purpose? His mind spun rapidly as he came to this conclusion. He then looked up and saw a tall, sturdy man with disheveled hair standing close by. The 3 punches from before had been given to him by this long-haired man. All right, that guy is dying. Go and make your wish come true, Blade said calmly. In order to fight against Pranav, Zen had in the past resorted to the Great Wishing spell. He might not be a match for Pranav, but he would still be able to fulfill his promise with someone else's help, as long as he personally killed Pranav. Chapter 1708, Infinite. Due to the unexpected occurrence of the event, Pranav became confused. He suffered 3 punches as he didn't have the time to analyze the situation. Bewilderment was apparent in his expression. As he heard Blade's remarks, Pranav's befuddlement grew even worse. Suddenly, Zen appeared next to Blade. Pranav's expression became stiff. You! Pranav's eyes flashed. Hatred was reflected in his eyes as he stared at Zen. Pranav had been planning to search for Zen meticulously, after he murdered all of those Supreme Lords. He was determined to find Zen, no matter the cost. The evolutionary universe was vast. However, with Pranav's cultivation base, he knew that there was nowhere for Zen to hide. Never would he have thought that the guy would actually show up and invite such a powerful expert. Pranav couldn't believe the situation he was in. Just then, Pranav still wondered why Blade only used 60% of his strength in his 3 punches instead of his maximum power to kill Pranav. Pranav was aware that the third punch of Blade would be able to kill him. When he finally saw Zen, Pranav immediately understood that Zen had once employed a wishing spell towards him. The reason why Blade did not kill him was just to make Zen fulfill the wishing spell. Zen slowly walked towards Pranav with the great weighty sword in his hand. Coldness was apparent in Zen's eyes. When he arrived in front of Pranav, Zen gently held the great weighty sword horizontally and pressed it against Pranav's neck. With the help of the wishing spell, Zen felt that his power had almost doubled. That was the advantage brought by the wishing spell, but the drawbacks were obvious. If Zen did not kill Pranav personally, his cultivation base would be permanently stagnated. Moreover, there was no way to break that curse, and Zen wouldn't be able to advance in his cultivation for the rest of his life. Therefore, even if most martial artists in the Divine Land could use the wishing spell, they were extremely cautious if they were to employ it. I realize the wish of the wishing spell. Slaughtering the one in front of me is enough to calm my indignation. His death would quell the anger in my heart. With this, I would be able to fulfill my vows to the wishing spell, Zen softly muttered before he raised great weighty sword in his hands. At that moment, Pranav no longer had the strength to struggle. Blade's punches seemed ordinary, but the war god Hall's ultimate technique was extraordinarily formidable and destructive. The rapid surge of blades fighting intent immediately extinguished the momentum within Pranav's body. At the same time, it entered Pranav's internal organs through his meridians and then penetrated his inner world. The holy being covered the heavens with the heavens-suppressing object, while the true God covered the inner world with the godly tile. Once the godly tile was formed, it would not be destroyed. However, once those streaks of fighting intent were infused into the inner world, they would completely wrap around Pranav's godly tile. That was equivalent to sealing off all of Pranav's momentum. The loss of connection with his godly tile had left Pranav helpless and weakened. With a sword pressed on his neck, Pranav knew that he was about to die. However, the smile on his face only became more and more pronounced. He then let out an arrogant laugh and said, "Do you really think that you can save the entire universe? And do you think you can save your father?" The arrogant words from Pranav's mouth caused the great weighty sword to freeze in midair. In fact, with Zen's current state of mind, no matter what Pranav said, it wasn't enough to affect him. However, Zen still responded with a calm tone, "No, I don't think so." "Then why are you struggling even though you are weak?" Pranav asked again with a prideful expression. Zen creased his brow as he actually thought about the question rather carefully. Blade, Lavender, Supreme Lord of Oracle, and the others saw that Zen had started to hesitate. Their confusion was reflected on each of their faces. The ancestral dragon gently whimpered at the side, with a vast, damaged body. Even its power could not save it from death. Its pair of huge eyes had also lost their luster. But when the ancestral dragon saw Zen, its initially dim eyes suddenly glowed with a bright light. Although the ancestral dragon was no longer affected by the imprint after it grew up, it still had a natural sense of intimacy with Zen. 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds. The heavens shook violently again, and one more Supreme Lord had just died. Zen still held his great weighty sword high up in the air. As he maintained his formidable posture, his mind wandered for an answer. Puzzlement and perplexity were apparent at Zen's face as he stared blankly at Pranav. Even though it was just a provocation, it was not easy for Zen to answer Pranav's question. From the very start, Zen had always struggled just because of his sister. He had survived all sorts of difficult situations just to get her back to his side. However, he finally realized that his father had personally arranged every predicament and danger for him. It had been a long time ever since he thought for a purpose about why he worked so hard to improve and to advance his cultivation. Pranav said such provocative words so that he could disturb Zen's state of mind and stall for time. If Mateo were to appear here, he would still have a sliver of a chance to survive. Naturally, he would not give up. He also felt pleased as he saw that Zen was stunned after he delivered his provocations. Actually, for Zen, Pranav had asked a critical question. The query Pranav gave was related to the purpose of Zen's life. Boom, boom, boom. Thunderous sounds of explosions could be heard from far away. The large balls of light exploded as the Supreme Lords continued their deadly battles. Even without the roaring token, the energy fluctuations and sounds of explosions could still spread very far away. Dozens of Supreme Worlds were already torn apart while countless creatures had also died. The smell of blood and corpses decorated the battlefield. A lot of creatures, even innocent ones, were murdered in the war. The deaths included mortals from thousands of kingdoms up to emperors who had just ascended to the throne. Innocent lives like women who were just about to give birth and infants who had not even opened their eyes to look at the world were also lost. Even scholars who had only participated in the imperial examinations were also trapped in at death's door. Many martial artists paid attention to the war in the universe. But, many of the ordinary mortals still focused on their own lives. Even after they sighed over the strange phenomenon that occurred in the heavens and earth, they could only suffer in silence. They didn't want the war, and yet, their lives were still forfeited. The innocent creatures didn't know whether the Supreme World where they stayed would be torn or not. Even if they knew the situation, they could not do anything about it. After all, it would be tough for them to leave a Supreme World no matter how hard they tried. They were like ants on a large ship. Even if they knew that this ship would sink, they wouldn't be able to escape to another ship. Despair enveloped them as they remained crippled by their powerlessness. What was the point of their lives? How could weak and pathetic creatures like them continue to live in such a war-torn place? As the lowest-level secondary creatures, these mortals also pursued beautiful things. They wanted to thrive and be able to find love and a family. They pursued more beautiful women, more beautiful songs, higher status, more respected positions, as well as more gold, silver, and jewelry. To many people, that was the meaning of life. Then, what was the meaning of Zen's life? Why was he born? Why was he still alive? Compared to those mortals, he might be far more powerful. He could easily dominate the destiny of mortals in tens of thousands of kingdoms. Such weak beings could be killed or subdued by him without a sweat. However, Zen himself was a secondary creature of the universe. Compared to the holy beings of the divine land, he was no different from those mortals. He, too, was pathetic when compared to beings of a higher power. What about the true gods and holy beings of the divine land? Compared to the extraordinary creatures, could it be that true gods were just like mortals? Additionally, holy beings might also be as insignificant as the emperors of mortals. His mind was limitless, and so was the world. Infinite. Zen had a hint of realization in his heart. A new perception became embodied in his mind. After 5 minutes, a hint of a smile appeared on the corner of Zen's mouth. The stiffness of his expression vanished and was replaced by a brave face. As he saw Zen's gaze, Pranav was a bit shocked. Despair crept inside him as his heart sank. It's for my own path. I continue to struggle for my own life path. Zen uttered with a smile. The great weighty sword in his hand moved slightly in the wind. His conviction became apparent in his expression. What is your life path? Pranav asked again as he wanted to stall for time. However, Zen shook his head and smiled peculiarly at Pranav. My life path is too remarkable and profound. It is on a level you can never achieve. You don't have the qualifications to know it. As he finished his words, Zen swung the great weighty sword. The mighty power poured out as his eyes were flooded with the malicious aura. He slashed out the god's intimidating strike in a flash. Puff! Fresh blood splattered everywhere. The ground was painted red as the stench of a recent death filled the air. The sword intent created by the god's intimidating strike passed through Pranav's body. It spread across the surface of the Supreme World. The Supreme World they were currently in was called Autumn Mountain World. There were many mountains within that Supreme World, and there were almost no plains. As Zen launched a sword strike, all the mountains within a radius of 1,000 miles were slashed and flattened. All that was left was a vast and wide plain. Later on, Zen's sword strike was vividly recorded by someone, and many warriors, even mortals, knew that Zen had killed a true god there. It was said that the blood of that true god had soaked into a particular part of the plain. Whoever could find the blood-soaked stone would be able to obtain the inheritance of that true god. It became a hunted treasure for warriors who wanted to strengthen themselves quickly. Thus countless warriors went there to dig and look for that stone, which made the entire plain full of bumps and hollows. As such, the plain was called the God-slaying plain. How could you be so powerful? What kind of comprehension have you gained? Lavender asked as she floated nearby Zen. Her slender body curled up and leaned against Zen's shoulder while she stared at him with a crooked face. Curiosity and a hint of fear were reflected in her eyes. Zen had been in a daze for a long time just then. Additionally, Zen's behavior was extremely abnormal. Lavender was afraid that he would spiral into madness. I'm fine. Zen took a deep breath and raised his head to look at the sky. Afterward, he tightened his grip on the great weighty sword. There's only one more left. After he murdered Pranav, Zen had finally realized his wish. At that moment, the power generated by the wishing spell had quickly disappeared from Zen's body. Chapter 1709, Wind's Head. Wind ruffled through Zen's matted hair as he raised his head to look at the sky. Another giant star had exploded in the inky sky. The star released a blinding light that covered the entire sky the moment it had exploded. The vast expanse of light caught everyone's attention, but they risked getting blind if they had stared too long. Once the bright light had dissipated, a dot of starlight quickly fell and flew across the sky at an incredible speed, and plummeted towards the dream sound world of the thoughtless minds. When Zen raised his eyebrows. Meanwhile in the dream sound world, the other two Supreme Lords, namely Master Feng and the Grand Supreme Lord of the Sacred Race were in the midst of a fierce battle. The situation was quite odd. The more the evolutionary universe was at a disadvantage, the more powerful Master Feng's evolution lotus flower became. At that moment, lotus flowers bloomed continuously in the whole dream sound world. They bloomed everywhere from the rocks, the mountaintops, the plains, city walls, and even the pots and stoves and the cyan tiles in the mortals' homes. Soon enough, the whole dream sound world was like a sea of lotus flowers. The sacred Grand Supreme Lord Spinulo's wood fern had taken root within the dream sound world. Its web of roots continued to spread, and so did the tree itself until it had formed a large, lush forest. While Master Feng absolutely had the upper hand against the sacred Grand Supreme Lord, he could not defeat him in such a short period of time. After all, as long as the sacred race's momentum existed, the sacred Grand Supreme Lord wouldn't be defeated. Therefore, the constant confrontation of the two caused the whole dream sound world to be plummeted into chaos. However, the two strongest Supreme Lords in the two universes stopped fighting when the comet-like light fell from the sky. Master Feng's face darkened as he saw the scene and said, "Win. Haha, the outcome of the war has already been decided. I'm afraid there is no meaning to our fight anymore." The Sacred Grand Supreme Lord laughed. And so, the war between the two universes and the fights between the Supreme Lords had lost all their meanings. After all, the most important thing was still the battle between the true gods. Since Win had already been defeated, then the victory would be on the side of the sacred race. "All sacred Supreme Lords, return to my side," the Sacred Grand Supreme Lord declared through a roaring token. Just then, all the fighting between the Supreme Lords of the two universes had stopped as well. Suddenly, demonic red space cracks appeared behind the Sacred Grand Supreme Lord and a total of 13 Sacred Supreme Lords emerged from them. The previously rejoicing Grand Sacred Supreme Lord was now appalled to see that only 13 Supreme Lords survived. All in all, they had actually lost 90% of their Supreme Lords in this war against the evolutionary universe. What a hefty price did they pay. On the other hand, streams of space law flowed behind Master Feng as the Supreme Lords of the evolutionary universe came to him. Soon enough, over 30 Supreme Lords had gathered beside him, including Supreme Lord of Original Sin. If only the battle between the Supreme Lords was to be considered, then it could be said that the evolutionary universe had completely won. However, so many Supreme Lords of the evolutionary universe could have been saved if Mateo and Marco hadn't been involved. Then again, the Supreme Lords who had survived had also noticed what was happening in the starry sky. They knew that Win had probably been defeated, which made them feel even more depressed. Even if they had the better advantage in the battles among the Supreme Lords, what use would that be against the Supreme Lords of the Murphy universe if Win was dead? Huff, huff. After quite a while, that comet-like stream of light had finally crashed in the Dream Sound world. Boom! The entirety of the Dream Sound world was split into perfect halves with a violent explosion. A crack that extended tens of billions of miles long ran across the middle and broke the Supreme World into two. Master Feng quickly led the Supreme Lords of the evolutionary universe to one side of the crack, while the Sacred Grand Supreme Lord and the other Supreme Lord stood on the opposite. The Supreme World's floor plates continued to move and the two groups became farther and farther from each other. "Is Win all right?" Supreme Lord Rowan of the Ogre race asked nervously. While he was only a mid-rank Supreme Lord, he had displayed extraordinary combat abilities in the battle. "I'm not sure. True gods couldn't die that easily," Supreme Lord Immortal said with a frown. All the Supreme Lords thought that once Win was dead, then everything was over. The two floor plates of the Dream Sound world continued to move further and further away, and the crack in the middle naturally became larger. Even the mountains on both sides of the crack began to collapse. When the crack had reached 100 miles in width, everyone present saw a tiny ball of light emerge from it. "Win, it's Winel, he hasn't died yet," the Supreme Lords shouted in joy, but everything had changed when they finally saw what was inside the ball of light in clear view. Wrapped in the ball of light was indeed Win, but only his head. The body below his head was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't a big deal for true gods to lose their limbs as they could regrow them with just a thought. The new limbs might not be as good as they were before, but it could be remedied with some secret training. However, the head and the cinnabar field were two parts that were indispensable. Losing a head was equivalent to losing a soul, and losing a cinnabar field was like losing the inner world and the godly tile within one's body that took eons to nurture. Even if Win technically wasn't dead, if his cinnabar field had been destroyed, he was as good as nothing. Buzz buzz buzz. A blazing white beam of light suddenly appeared on the side of the ball of light, which rapidly transformed into a human silhouette. After a few moments, Mateo arose from the silhouette. Moments ago, the Sacred Supreme Lords had been worried about Mateo's situation. After all, the power of the explosion in the starry sky was too overwhelming. The explosion of the star was enough to destroy thousands of Supreme Worlds. If Mateo hadn't withstood the strike and died, then their efforts wouldn't be worth it. Of course, the Sacred Supreme Lords still had a strong advantage. Even if the two true gods Mateo and Win died together, they still had other two true gods, Marco and Pranav. They could help them deal with the upcoming battles. What the Sacred Supreme Lords did not know was that Blade had already killed the other two true gods. "You old Win, you actually destructed your inner world, and turned it into the Star Tribulation Wave. You really wanted to die with me." Ahem. Mateo grinned fiendishly as he spoke. Right after he finished speaking, he coughed twice and streams of black blood spurted out from his mouth. It was true that Mateo had won, but not without serious injuries. He had the upper hand during the first half of his battle against Win. However, he had underestimated his opponent. Although he was able to suppress Win in every aspect, his state of mind couldn't compare to that of Win. As Mike's favorite as well as youngest disciple, Win already had the resolve to sacrifice himself. Thus, his every strike meant to cause absolute destruction on both sides. That was also why Mateo had felt that the situation was very tricky. In the latter part of their battle, Win had lured Mateo straight into the star maze that he had set up beforehand. After that, he detonated the inner world in his body and launched a desperate attack, known as the Star Tribulation Wave. In turn, Mateo had used the wheel swirl technique in that critical moment to guard his own body and stood the Star Tribulation Wave by force. Therefore, he had ended up with numerous injuries. Crack! A splitting sound was heard when Mateo loosely grabbed at the air and the ball of light landed in his hand. No, stop! A sharp gust of wind blew as Master Feng appeared beside the ball of light in a flash, in an attempt to snatch the ball of light from Mateo. Who do you think you are? Get out of here! Mateo was furious at the sudden intrusion and threw a punch. Master Feng felt as if he had been struck by lightning and a fist imprint appeared on his chest. He fell backwards like a kite with its string suddenly cut, then collided into the edge of the broken Supreme World and shattered a mountain range in the process. When the other Supreme Lords who originally planned to wait for a chance to take action saw the scene, they gave up their ideas. The gap between them and Mateo was far too big. The ball of light finally ended up in Mateo's hands, and his lips curled into a sinister smile. He gently pinched the surface of the ball of light, which shattered like an eggshell. His hands grabbed Win's decapitated head and lifted it up for all of them to see. Ha ha ha, I didn't expect you to be so troublesome, to the point that I had to use my wheel swirl technique. You old fellow, how do you feel right now? Would you like to share it with the followers of your master? Once the words died on Mateo's mouth, he turned Win's head to the side and made it face the Supreme Lords of the evolutionary universe. Chapter 1710, The Unexpected Image. Win hadn't perished completely. A true god's soul was particularly tough. Even if one was beheaded, they could still think up a way to reconstruct their body. But it was a lengthy process. Reconstructing the body and cinnabar field was equal to cultivating all over again. The eyes on Win's head suddenly shot open and looked up at Master Feng and the group of Supreme Lords on the other side. The originally star-like bright eyes were now completely devoid of any light. To fight against the sacred race, Win had led the celestial position in planning countless years, only to end up with awful results. When Murphy changed the rules in a snap, everyone's hard work and effort turned into nothing. Anyone facing such a blow would naturally lose all confidence, and Win was no exception. You have nothing else to say, do you? Ha ha, then go to perdition. Mateo grinned viciously. Suddenly, he pulled up Win's gray hair and threw the head away. Forming a fist with one hand, he got ready to smash his head apart in a single punch. Win's head spiraled continuously in the sky. The starry sky, the earth, and the mountains seemed to be rolling images in his eyes as he was thrown. Although he looked like a man of old age, he was still relatively young among the true gods. While lurking in the evolutionary universe, he was under his master's protection at all times. In his life's final moment, time had slowed immeasurably and the entire evolutionary universe left him with a nostalgic heart. Master, I failed, Win muttered weakly. As his head circled in the air, a sudden blaze of white light appeared close by. Because his head was spinning quickly, the scene was a blur. But after his head spun for another circle, he suddenly saw an unexpected image. Zen, Lavender, and Supreme Lord of Oracle walked out from the crack in space. And in the end, he also saw a long-haired man exuding an extraordinary aura. Who was that long-haired man? Master Feng thought in wonder. When Win's head started spinning again, he felt a sudden wave of power grabbing onto it before it was thrown away again. Now with a faster rotation, it was difficult for Win to see what was happening around him. In an instant, his head was caught and he could see that Supreme Lord of Oracle was beside him, shooting him a wink. Win, it's over, Zen voiced from behind him. It's over. What's over? Finding his bearings again, he realized that it was Zen who caught him and that the long-haired man standing in Mateo's way was the one who grabbed his head and threw it to Zen. What a strong fighting intent. It's the people from the War God Hall. Refined starlight suddenly shone from Win's gloomy eyes. While he had no idea of the long-haired man's origins, there was no doubt that he was invited by Zen and was on his side. All the Supreme Lords in the evolutionary universe were wide-eyed in shock. After Win was defeated, the Supreme Lords knew they were at a disadvantage. The war had ended in the evolutionary universe's defeat. Only a miracle could reverse the situation and the odds of that were too slim. When Win's head was thrown into the air, many of the Supreme Lords wanted to rush out and snatch it away. But even if they did, what would be the use? Could they make a difference? If the evolutionary universe collapsed, everything, from an ant in the lower world to the countless Supreme Lords in the upper world would perish. It was only a matter of who would die first. So at that point, everything seemed meaningless. There were even some Supreme Lords that decided to retreat. Since resistance had become meaningless, they figured they would take advantage of the last bit of time they had to do something meaningful among their own races. At the very least, they could do something fulfilling during their last days. No one was expecting Zen to appear at that crucial moment. A glimmer of hope rose in everyone's hearts when they saw Zen and Supreme Lord of Oracle suddenly appear. But no matter how many miracles the man had created, he was still only a godly genius at the World Lord level. His overall influence on the entire battle wasn't so great. Just then, hope returned when a burly long-haired man walked out behind him. A true god. A very powerful true god. A true god. Does Zen bring him here to help? The moment they saw Blade, they immediately picked out his unique aura as that of a true god. And his fighting intent was even more powerful. After he appeared, Blade didn't take any further action, waiting for Zen's order. A calm smile hung on his face and his whole body seemed to glow with a brilliant blue light. Such was the embodiment of his extreme fighting intent. Mateo's smile froze. The Supreme Lords behind him felt their bodies stiffen and their thoughts come to a halt. A true god's arrival was completely unforeseen. Who are you? This is a dispute between two holy beings. If you get involved, Mateo voiced coldly. His words were similar to Marco's and Pranav's. They all wanted to threaten Blade with Murphy's name and reputation. If I get involved, will Murphy never let me go? I've heard these words 3 times today. Don't you have anything new to say? Blade yawned and smiled cockily. 3 times. Then, Mateo's eyes flashed with realization. What happened to Marco and Pranav? What do you think? Blade cocked his head to the side. Never did Mateo think he had to worry about Marco's and Pranav's safety. He had no clue that the two had perished while he was focused on his battle against Win. Now, Mateo couldn't see a trace of them as he searched with his soul power. Though he wanted to leave that to the fact that he couldn't search the entire universe with his soul power, they could have also been too far away. He somehow had a strong feeling that the man in front of him had already killed them. How dare you? Mateo roared. Balls of black fog began spreading from his body. In spite of their conflicts, Pranav, Marco, and Mateo had cultivated together in the Murphy universe. Who would have thought that 2 of them would disappear in a blink of an eye? The thought made Mateo turn extremely indignant. But Blade only rolled his eyes at Mateo's fury. He turned to Zen and asked, "This guy is getting noisy and annoying. Can I kill him now?" The Supreme Lords in the evolutionary universe were speechless in shock. To think that such a strong person was asking Zen for permission. What was their relationship? Zen flew back to the top of the cliff and handed Win's head to Master Feng. Then, he turned to Blade and gave the order. Go ahead. Ha! Blade's laughter resounded as a blazing light burst from beneath his feet, and then he pounced towards Mateo without hesitation. Boom! The battle between the true gods began. When Mateo battled Win, he had already consumed over half of his life vitality because Win launched the Star Tribulation wave, injuring him severely. But even in his best condition, Mateo was no match for Blade. Given the difference in their strength, it was unlikely that Mateo even had a shot at winning this fight. So the moment the fight began, Mateo threw attacks continuously as he retreated, facing Blade's formidable attacks. He barely had any strength to fight back. Up on the cliff, Zen didn't even bother looking back. Meanwhile, the Supreme Lords of the Sacred Race and the evolutionary universe had mixed feelings of hope and worry. The people of the evolutionary universe thought that Mateo could have other trump cards to use against Blade. And the Sacred Supreme Lords hoped that Murphy would protect Mateo long enough for him to turn the tide. But Zen's behavior made it clear that Blade wasn't his only way to deal with Mateo if he managed to win the fight. At the very least, he still had the mysterious woman in blue by his side. While Zen couldn't clearly see through the strength of these true gods, Master Evil and Wayne were definitely stronger than Blade, and the woman in blue seemed to be even more powerful than the former. The Sacred Race had no way to turn the situation around other than Murphy coming down to join the battle himself. Chapter 17:11. Soul Eater Summoning Method. Bam! Accompanied by the muffled sound, Mateo collided into the ground after being punched powerfully by Blade. Then, a crack appeared across the earth, revealing a gaping hole. These waves-devouring worms are able to devour most of my fighting intent. They possess a pretty good set of abilities. Raising these small worms within your body would probably be a very difficult task, Blade lightly said. What a pity, it's still far from enough. Right after he finished speaking, Blade chased after Mateo viciously. A series of muffled explosions then arose left and right. For a moment, the fighting intent filled the area and the black light seemed blinding. The dream sound world was only a narrow battle ring to the two true gods. This broken battle ring was collapsing quickly. Zen didn't seem interested in the fight as he walked towards Supreme Lord of Original Sin. He then handed over a space ring to him. Supreme Lord of Original Sin greeted Zen with gratitude upon receiving the space ring in his palm. He gave Zen a light nod and they simultaneously turned their heads to look at the other side. Apparently, Supreme Lord Lester was standing right behind them the entire time. Supreme Lord Lester's heavenly destiny of revival was very significant and precious. This led him to never participate in a battle. He was even able to revive the Supreme Lords who had just lost their lives. Since the beginning of the chaotic war, he saved the lives of 7 Supreme Lords with just his miraculous heavenly destiny of revival. On the other hand, the space ring that Zen had given to Supreme Lord of Original Sin was keeping Maha's Silver Moon Wolves. These were the wolves Zen had previously killed as he saw them feasting on Nathan's corpse. Zen made it a point to store the wolves as much as he could, because they would have Nathan's parts in them. He stored the fragments of the wolves and Nathan into the space ring, and hoped that Nathan was lucky enough to be revived by Supreme Lord Lester. Margaret's corpse was also placed strategically into another space ring. However, her body was completely preserved in comparison to Nathan. With the heavenly destiny of revival's power, it would be simple enough to revive her. They knew that reviving Margaret was not going to be too difficult, but Zen couldn't help but worry. As the battle between the two true gods went on, the sacred Supreme Lords didn't intend to take action. They already knew that joining the battle wouldn't benefit the situation in any way. Looking at it critically, they'd have to deal with Master Feng, Supreme Lord of Original Sin, Supreme Lord of Oracle, many mid-rank Supreme Lords and low-rank Supreme Lords of the evolutionary universe if they made a move. All of the Supreme Lords, from both sides, understood this. It would be useless to take action. This was where Zen decided to take advantage of the situation. He'd hoped that at this time, Supreme Lord Lester could resurrect Margaret and Nathan. Zen held out Margaret's corpse and held her horizontally in his hands, carefully transferring the corpse to Supreme Lord Lester. Margaret's eyes were closed very tight. She was a docile woman, and her face was very serene, almost as if she was merely sleeping. Zen gently shook her hand with a trace of sadness in his eyes. He then placed her lightly on the ground and made a gesture to ask Supreme Lord Lester to start resurrecting her. Supreme Lord Lester nodded in agreement. He extended his hand and pressed it lightly against his forehead, and a wheel of light slowly rose up above his head. That was known as the heavenly destiny of revival. This light wheel surrounded Margaret's corpse. "There's no problem to revive her," said Supreme Lord Lester. "I can activate her life energy with the heavenly destiny of revival, but the process will take some time." Zen heaved a sigh of relief when he heard Supreme Lord Lester's words. There was definitely a lot of time. As for Supreme Lord of Original Sin who stood beside them, he poured out the corpse pieces of the Silver Moon Wolves from the space ring. The fragments of the Silver Moon Wolves had fallen onto the ground, and the stench of blood filled the air. There were hints of golden blood as well, probably belonging to Nathan. As the surrounding Supreme Lords saw this, they frowned. Although Supreme Lord Lester's heavenly destiny of revival was deemed very strong, there was always a limit to his abilities. Because Nathan was torn to pieces and even swallowed by the wolves, it was uncertain if he could be revived or not. Supreme Lord Lester also revealed a hesitant expression. He didn't have any confidence in resurrecting Nathan, though he knew he had to try. On another note, Supreme Lord of Original Sin, a top-ranked Supreme Lord leading the Thoughtless Minds, was anxious and worried at this moment. He had never been so upset before. When he had to face the disciples of the true God, he managed to remain calm. However, Nathan's life seemed to take a toll on him. He was very uneasy thinking about the uncertainty. "I can only do my best," said Supreme Lord Lester as he observed the corpse pieces. Then, he gently waved his hand and the wheel of light moved out again, circling around the fragments like a halo. As the light radiated around the fragments, they began to squirm and wiggle, coming to life. Each part seemed to know its original position, and moved towards it. This included the parts that belonged to the Silver Moon Wolves. The heavenly destiny of revival belonged directly to the life law. However, this kind of theurgy could be only used on secondary creatures. This was a rule because the magical ability of resurrection didn't exist in the Divine Land. In the past, the universe was still too small compared to the Divine Land, and only holy beings could bestow this ability to the inner world. This made Supreme Lord Lester's heavenly destiny of revival something quite useless to win. The pieces of the corpses continued to move around and piece themselves together, and a gentle life energy was emitted from the heavenly destiny of revival. The pieces were slowly regained life energy throughout the process. Because Zen had killed all of these silver moon wolves, he put all the fragments of wolves into the space ring. Not long later, the silver moon wolves' fragments had actually assembled together completely, but for some reason, the cracks and divisions were still visible. Remarkably, Nathan's body was also perfectly assembled, but because he had been devoured by the wolves, only the silhouette of a person could be seen. Supreme Lord of Original Sin had a very blank expression as he tried his best to suppress his emotions. No one could feel comfortable while watching these sorts of things. Moreover, because Nathan was his son, he was incomparably sad seeing him like that. In another swift movement, Supreme Lord Lester waved his hand once more, and a beam of faint green light of life began to escape from the circular plate hovering over his head. The heavenly destiny of revival was not simply used by means of the life law, because Supreme Lord Lester did not simply heal them. He had to completely bring back the life in them, and this meant that the time law was somehow incorporated into the process. As the light continued to beam outwards, it eventually turned into a light green tower, enveloping Supreme Lord Lester and the corpses of Nathan and Margaret with it. The people who were left to watch could no longer see anything except the green light. With the Supreme Lord's soul power, it would be quite easy to detect what was happening within the tower. However, it was of common knowledge to not disturb Supreme Lord Lester at this moment. Moreover, most Supreme Lords only seemed to care about the battle of the true gods, so they shifted their attention towards that. In comparison to Marco and Pranav, Matteo proved to be a lot stronger. To endure that for so long while injured was something people wouldn't even attempt to do. However, at this point, he was like a spent arrow. The Supreme Lords, Blade and Matteo all knew this. When Matteo was eventually tested to his limits, the two streams of black tears finally stopped flowing from his eyes. "Are you giving up?" Blade asked lightly. This was a tough question mostly because Matteo's self-esteem was extremely high. His skill and perseverance were outstanding, so he had never been put in a situation where someone had to ask him if he would give up. Besides, this wasn't any ordinary battle. He was determined to win. At this moment, a hint of anger appeared across his face as he stared at Blade. "I have never known what it felt like to give up," he said. "And I'm not starting now." As he finished, he suddenly smacked his forehead with a heavy hand. Just then, a strange silhouette began to develop above his forehead, intricately formed with golden lines. Eventually, this formation developed into a strange, humanoid creature coming out of his forehead. This human-like being grabbed Matteo and stuffed him into its mouth, all in one go. Seeing this, Blade retreated immediately in fear. A chuckle echoed through the mist of the divine land. "Murphy, your disciple really isn't good. Although Blade has been missing for so many years, his cultivation has been improved by a great deal. This surprises me." The laugh just lasted for only a short while, but it was obvious that the holy being who had spoken had seen the strange change in Matteo. His usual composed voice also became firm as he said, "Murphy, you have even imparted such a vicious cultivation method, such as the Soul Eater summoning method, to your disciple. Are you crazy?" Chapter 17:12. Grand Fighting Technique. It really is the Soul Eater summoning method. Anyone who uses this evil magic will never be reincarnated. They'll be tormented for all eternity. Murphy's crazy for teaching his disciple that horrid magic. The Soul Eater summoning method was a dark and pernicious martial art. This magic allowed a warrior to summon a Soul Eater at the price of their soul. It was an irreversible contract that subjected a person's soul to eternal torment. As its name implied, Soul Eaters devoured and inflicted pain on the summoner's soul in order to gain energy. The more pain inflicted, the more power the Soul Eater got. In the past divine eras, when the true gods realized the danger and consequences that came with the Soul Eater summoning method, they had forbidden the practice and spread of the art in the whole divine land. And as time passed, the number of true gods that knew about the Soul Eater summoning method became less and less. No holy being ever imagined that Murphy would pass on the Soul Eater summoning method to his disciple. As soon as the golden threads had completely devoured Matteo, a Soul Eater had immediately formed. Its body morphed into weird shapes until it grew a potbelly and a double chin. With a fiendish aura and a heavy black mist shrouding its body, it resembled a fat evil Buddha. And as if that wasn't creepy enough, its face was scarily similar to Matteo's. So painful. It groaned brokenly, voice as rough as sandpaper. Matteo's soul was fully absorbed by the Soul Eater. Its beady black eyes stared at Blade intently for a few seconds before it suddenly twisted its enormous body and pounced at Blade. Boom! Blade dodged just in time. As he jumped backward to avoid the attack, he had managed to throw a punch at the space in front of him, destroying the area and releasing a strong counterforce that accelerated his retreat. Unfortunately, the Soul Eater was even faster. Seeing Blade move to a distance, the Soul Eater flash-stepped and instantly caught up with him. Like two giant mallets, its two hands slammed down on Blade. Blade's eyes flashed with fierce determination. His torrential fighting intent ignited and boiled to the surface, engulfing his body in blue flames. He had unleashed the momentum, his full fighting intent, from his inner world. At this moment, all living beings in his inner world had sensed the looming danger. The true God used his godly tile to suppress the heavens, which forced all the living beings to pray. Every single one of them was emitting a fighting intent which flowed like countless small streams that slowly joined together to form rivers. They turned into a great river, which eventually turned into an ocean, fusing into Blade's godly tile. This fighting intent was the same as the faith energy that Lavender possessed. True gods relied on the faith energy from the living beings in their inner worlds in order to unleash their strongest, most fearsome powers. Once they became holy beings, however, they'd be able to cover the heavens of their inner worlds with heaven-suppressing objects, ridding them of their dependence on faith energy. In other words, they could directly borrow the power of the universe without the worship of living beings. Buzz. Within Blade's inner world, his azure godly tile trembled violently as a strange power gushed out from his elixir field. Grand fighting technique. With a shout, Blade extended his hands above his head, and a blue turtle shell materialized in his right hand and a short halberd in his left. Boom! Crack! Blade used the turtle shell to block the Soul Eater's incoming attack as he aimed at the Soul Eater with the halberd. Boom! The impact caused an explosion in the sky and an invisible shockwave to spread out, reducing everything it hit into dust. Everything within a 10 million mile radius was blown to bits. The force was so strong that even the Supreme Lords who were far away from the fight had felt a great pressure. In an effort to protect Zen and the rest, Supreme Lord of Original Sin joined hands with Master Feng to create a protective barrier around the lot. The Supreme Lords of the Sacred Race also did the same for their weaker members, and save for these two great lands, the entirety of the Dream Sound world was annihilated. So, this is a true god's real power. Zen muttered. As he watched the fight, he couldn't help but worry about the progress of Margaret's revival. A sigh escaped his lips. This shockwave alone was enough to shatter 4 supreme worlds. At his current stage, Zen's physical strength was far more than Blade's. However, he also knew that even with all the power of the 9 divine stars, he still wouldn't be able to achieve such a grand-scale result. Pock! Crack! A crack appeared on Blade's turtle shell shield and quickly spread all over its surface. A second later, it shattered to pieces, and his halberd snapped in half. Blade breathed heavily. The halberd had managed to pierce through the Soul Eater's hand, causing dark mist to seep from the wound. The Soul Eater groaned in pain. Hurts, so much. Irritated by the pain, the Soul Eater's body expanded once more. Its golden skin shone brighter and brighter and its vicious aura increased until it was almost palpable. Whoosh! With a giant hand, it slapped Blade hard. Bang! The attack had been so quick and sudden that Blade had no time to dodge. The impact of the Soul Eater's hand on Blade's body caused another shockwave, and sent Blade flying backwards, through a supreme world, and into the lower world, disappearing from everyone's sights. Having lost its opponent, the Soul Eater turned its big head and looked to where Zen was standing. Even with his soul devoured and unconscious, Mateo's hatred was alive and burning. His eyes gleamed with malice. There was no one he hated more than Zen. He had put in blood, sweat, and tears to kill Win. But just when he was about to help his master win the Universal War, Zen and Blade had to appear and ruin everything, leaving him no choice but to use the Soul Eater summoning method. Now he had to endure an eternity of pain. With his present visual acuity, Zen was unable to see beyond several supreme worlds. However, he knew from Blade's weakening fighting intent that he had already lost the fight. Meanwhile, the Soul Eater's gaze had caused a cold, sinister feeling to wash over him. This was bad. Seeing that things weren't going in their favor, Master Feng summoned the Evolution Lotus Flower. They weren't just going to sit and wait for death. They'd do whatever was necessary in order to stay alive. On the other hand, the Sacred Supreme Lords wore proud smiles. They never imagined Mateo had it in him to turn the situation around to their favor. They could only imagine the lengths Mateo had to go through in order to give them their victory. Chapter 1713, Possessed. The menacing Soul Eater was approaching. It was massive, around the size of a mountain, and although it did not use grand teleportation, it still managed to cross several supreme worlds in just 1 minute. It's coming. Supreme Lord Lester, you have to go now. Let me block it. If Blade was unable to defeat this monster, then what more the other Supreme Lords could do? They knew they couldn't possibly win this fight, but they couldn't just revert into meek lambs who waited to be slaughtered by the wolf. They were Supreme Lords and they would fight this monster to the death if need be. At that moment, Zen raised his head and stared up at the sky. Are you still not going to make your move? His words stunned Master Feng, along with the other Supreme Lords. They all looked at him with strange expressions. Zen, who are you talking to? Do you know someone who can help us? Is that person more powerful than that long-haired man? The Supreme Lords began to ask in earnest. Seeing that Zen wasn't that nervous from the start, Supreme Lord of Oracle figured that the young man might have some tricks up his sleeve, and he seemed very confident in his trump card. Zen chose not to directly answer their questions, but there was a faint smile on his face as he looked at the sacred Supreme Lords on the other side. The blue-clothed woman was enslaved by him, but he still respected her. If she wasn't willing to appear right now, she might have her reasons. He could only ask her. Who? The blast of the wind was deafening as the Soul Eater continued passing through several more supreme worlds. It was now only a few million miles away now. It would only take it a split second to cross this distance with its fast-traveling speed. The sacred Supreme Lords were naturally overjoyed. If the Soul Eater managed to kill all these Supreme Lords in one go, then that would save them a great deal of effort in truly conquering the evolutionary universe. After all, the sacred race had lost so many Supreme Lords on their side, and if they acted rashly now, they were afraid that they would lose more. However, at that moment, a pillar of blazing light appeared in front of Zen. From the space crack emerged a burly figure. Blade, no, you're too injured, you don't have to fight. Zen told him. He had thought that it was the blue-clothed woman that was going to make her move. Blade's body was currently bathed in blood. After that slap from the Soul Eater, his body was worse for wear. He had broken bones and muscles all over his body, and blood that poured continuously from his wounds. His entire body was like a porcelain figure which was fit together with broken pieces. Huff, huff, Blade breathed heavily. I promised you that I would help you kill those 3 enemies. I'm not someone who goes back on their word. Zen shook his head. You're not that guy's match. Moreover, you've already helped me kill 3 true gods, Mateo, Pranav, and Marco. Ha ha ha, the warriors of the War God Hall always keep their promises. I cannot go against my heart. As he said this, a heroic aura burst forth from Blade's body. The wounds he had endured suddenly healed, and a fighting intent, fiercer than before, emanated from him. This fighting intent turned into bands of light that visibly surrounded him in ripples. Grand fighting technique. 6-5 fist. Pop, 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 pop. 6 circular patterns suddenly appeared in front of Blade. He grabbed each one and the 6 patterns quickly converged and glowed on his palm. The aura then disappeared along with the fighting intent. At that moment, Blade closed his fist, which emitted a faint blue light from the patterns earlier. There was only determination in his eyes. Deep in the dense fog of the Divine Land. Woodruff, this young man is not bad. He's a good person. There aren't many people who have mastered the 6-5 fist, not even in the War God Hall, right? What a pity. There is a high possibility for him to die if he were to fight a Soul Eater head-on. Blade, don't be a fool. A roar reverberated in the fog from the holy being of the War God Hall. Blade's spirit was very admirable, but his actions were no different from suicide. The War God Hall had searched for him for so long, and the moment he appeared, it seemed that he was about to give his life away for the virtue of the fight. Holy beings were forbidden from interfering in the war between universes. Mike and Murphy were no exception. The consequences of breaking the rules written on the stone slab were too serious for them to bear. Do you still not want to come out? Zen asked a second time. He also didn't want Blade to lose his life like this. Alas! A faint sigh murmured near his ear. The sigh was almost inaudible, but a voice then began to speak softly in his mind. I indeed do not want to reveal myself, so I can only borrow your body for now. I hope you don't mind, Master. Hee hee. There was another soft laugh that gradually faded out. At the next moment, Zen suddenly felt as if he had lost control of his own body. It seemed that the blue-clothed woman had possessed him. Zen couldn't help but feel as if he had been tricked. The enslaving token ensured that he had that woman under his thumb, but she was able to take over his body so easily. This was quite ironic and far too much. However, no matter how loud he yelled in madness, nobody would really be able to hear him. The moment she took control of his body, She had already isolated his soul from his mind. At that moment, Zen didn't even have the ability to release his perception. Zen, what are you doing? Lavender asked as she looked at Zen strangely. Before she could stop him, Zen had already darted past and arrived in front of Blade. Zen's movements were too fast. What she saw was only a flash of light in the whole process. His movements also stunned the Supreme Lords. Supreme Lord of Oracle and the others also couldn't help but look at Supreme Lord Helm. Zen was only a world lord who could cross a distance of 10,000 miles at most using grand teleportation. Blade had been millions of miles away from him, so it was impossible for him to have gotten so close at such a short amount of time. Had Supreme Lord Helm thrown Zen using the space lock? What was his purpose in sending Zen there? Did he want to send the young man to his death? Noticing the strange looks the other Supreme Lords were giving him, Supreme Lord Helm was quick to prove his innocence. He shook his head fervently. It's not me. I have long since unshackled the space lock on Zen. Then how did he do it? One of the Supreme Lords asked. How should I know? Supreme Lord Helm shot back. There are a lot of unimaginable things that had already happened to that guy. Ask him yourself. What should we do now? Should we go to help him? Supreme Lord of Oracle did not care why Zen was suddenly behaving like this, all she cared about was his safety. Master Feng frowned as the evolution lotus flower spun above his head. Let us watch what will happen first. Zen would never act so rashly. He might be planning something. Meanwhile, Blade was already brimming with fighting intent and was ready to unleash his 6-5 fist. Zen's sudden appearance suddenly threw him off. What are you doing here? Zen merely smiled at him and Blade couldn't help but feel something strange with that smile. Step back, Zen told him. The tone and the expression on Zen's face confused Blade greatly. He knew that the voice was Zen's, but it was definitely another person. Why did he feel as if the young man's manner resembled that of the blue-clothed woman? Thinking quickly, Blade finally realized what just happened. Just as he was about to speak, Zen had already placed his hand on his shoulder. An intense mysterious aura hit Blade on the face as Zen made a strange gesture by pressing the tips of his thumb and forefinger together while keeping the other 3 fingers raised. The young man then lightly brushed against Blade's shoulder with his fingers. Blade suddenly felt himself shooting backwards before smashing into the Supreme World where the Supreme Lords of the evolutionary universe were staying. Just as Zen pushed Blade away, the Soul Eater burst forth and suddenly charged towards him. Zen quickly turned and brushed his hand upwards towards the monster. As his fingers lightly brushed his opponent, Zen was able to skillfully change the Soul Eater's direction and made it charge up into the sky. Chapter 17:14, Explosion. As soon as the Soul Eater flew upwards, Zen's gaze followed it. In a flash he disappeared from where he stood. The next moment, he appeared right above the Soul Eater. He twisted his body in an astonishing way and rammed his elbow into the monster's head. Thump, the elbow struck with a dull sound. The amount of energy Zen put did not have much impact. But despite the blunt blow, the Soul Eater started rapidly descending. Arg, the pain. What did you do? Physically, the Soul Eater did not seem to have suffered any heavy injuries, and the top of its head was not at all damaged in the least. But it seemed to be in enormous pain. The faint green light in its eyes grew brighter by the minute, and its entire body started expanding once again. Its incomparably vicious aura began to spread out in all directions, causing the hearts of all the living beings within a radius of 10 million miles to sink. However, despite this sight, Zen hardly felt any trace of fear. His body vanished and appeared below the Soul Eater, which was now looming like a giant mountain. In front of this monstrous being, Zen looked like a tiny sparrow. But the tiny sparrow launched a ferocious attack on the behemoth beast, forcefully lifting it up. At the same time, one could hear the painful roar of the Soul Eater. Zen's blow was so enormous that every attack had a painful effect on the Soul Eater. And with each pain, the monster increased in size. So by now, the Soul Eater had become like a giant ball that Zen kept kicking. The Supreme Lords of both sides looked at Zen, their facial expressions filled with mixed emotions. They couldn't believe their eyes at the sight they were witnessing. How in the world does he manage to do this? Has Zen actually condensed the godly tile and become a true god? That long-haired man is an extremely powerful true god, but he isn't a match for the Soul Eater. Even if Zen has condensed the godly tile, he can't really fight against that monster. The Supreme Lords whispered amongst themselves. Zen's performance was definitely a good news for the evolutionary universe. However, this scene was simply too shocking. Even Supreme Lord of Oracle and the others found it hard to accept. No, he hasn't condensed the godly tile, Master Feng said, shaking his head in denial. His lotus flower hasn't fully bloomed for him to become a complete godly genius. As the controller of the evolution lotus flower, Master Feng was very clear on the degree of blooming of every martial artist in the universe, and the lotus flowers of the 10 godly geniuses were his top priorities. After returning from the divine refinement forbidden land, barring Zen, all the godly geniuses, lotus flowers had bloomed in immediate succession. But this did not deter Zen's strength. Then how do you explain this marvelous feat? There has to be some major reason behind this. The Supreme Lords couldn't figure it out despite their vast knowledge. It was all a very appalling matter for them, as they had never experienced such a situation before. Blade's entire body was embedded in an iron cast. He came in this situation after being tackled by Zen. The blue-clothed woman injected a surge of power inside him, which restricted his movements. It was obvious that the blue-clothed woman did not want him to fight again. When he heard the discussions of the Supreme Lords, he only smiled faintly. Although he could speak, he didn't bother to explain it to them. The Supreme Lords of the sacred race might be the most depressed now. Although Mateo had defeated Win, he was suppressed by Blade. Therefore, he had no choice but to resort to the Soul Eater summoning method. They seemed to be gripped with anxiety. Every time they thought their victory was in sight, someone would suddenly appear and crush their hopes. Thump, thump, thump. Zen's every attack made it more painful for the Soul Eater. As the pain became more and more intense, the Soul Eater continuously expanded. Soon the Soul Eater had reached a height of over 10,000 miles that could be compared to the size of a supreme world. Such an enormous creature stood between the heaven and earth, and was visible to many from far away. The Soul Eater seemed to have reached the limit of its growth. It was like a ball that was blown up to its full extent. The dark golden skin on its body had already become translucent. Compared to such a huge creature, Zen's image was a minuscule that could be ignored. Zen appeared on the giant belly of the Soul Eater. The belly's surface was so large that it could hold tens of thousands of cities. He narrowed his eyes and a mysterious smile appeared on his face. Let's end this. The Soul Eater summoning method shouldn't have existed between heaven and earth. It will be a relief to you as well. You will thank me later. After saying this, Zen knelt down on one knee on the Soul Eater's belly. He extended his hand, the tips of his thumb and the forefinger touching the belly, while he raised the other 3 fingers. He gently drew a cyan line across the belly. In the blink of an eye, the line extended from a few inches to several tens of feet into several miles. Soon, a huge pattern appeared on the belly of the Soul Eater. It's the Soul Eater removing technique. That's impossible. Secondary creatures can't cultivate the Soul Eater removing technique. How did he manage to cultivate it in the evolutionary universe? There's something strange and special about him. He can't achieve such a feat. The holy beings from the Hall of Holy Beings quickly figured out what was going on. Despite the long distance between them and Zen, they were still able to see that there was something wrong with Zen. Ouch! When the pattern appeared, the Soul Eater looked even more painful. It furiously flapped its huge arms around its belly. Zen smiled faintly and disappeared from where he stood. In a flash, he appeared next to Blade. With the blue-clothed woman's highest cultivation level, he was able to freely move around the universe without anyone stopping him. It's all over. Zen lightly patted Blade's shoulder, and then leapt up and walked towards the Supreme Lords. However, before he could take a few steps, he suddenly went limp and fell to the ground. Zen, are you all right? Lavender looked anxious as she swiftly stepped forward to help Zen. The scene that had just occurred had an astounding effect on her. When Zen got up, he had a depressed look on his face. The cultivation of the blue-clothed woman had reached an astounding level. She used his body to resist the Soul Eater without using too much strength, but just with these simple methods, she was able to easily subdue that monster. Her understanding of strength had already reached a level that Zen could not comprehend. Don't worry, it's over, Zen comforted Lavender as he looked at her anxious face. As soon as he finished his sentence, the Soul Eater started to moan again. The body that was already unimaginably huge started to swell again. It had already expanded to its limit before, so it could no longer bear further inflation. Bang! Finally the body exploded with an earth-shattering explosion. It sounded like hundreds of stars exploding together. Such was the impact of this explosion. The shockwave spread out in all directions, and its power was even greater than before. With the place where the Soul Eater exploded as the center, hundreds of supreme worlds around were completely destroyed. Countless living beings were instantly turned into dust. The only ones to survive the explosion were the Supreme Lords from the evolutionary universe as well as from the sacred race. If one were to look down from above, he or she would be able to see that the densely packed Supreme Worlds were neatly arranged together like discs. But now the image was scarred with a huge hole in the thoughtless minds, which was caused by the explosion of the Soul Eater. "It's definitely over," Supreme Lord of Oracle muttered. Although there were still over a dozen Supreme Lords and the Grand Supreme Lord of the sacred race in front of her, the disparity in strength was too great. There was no longer any powerhouse left for the Murphy universe to fight. Master Feng, Supreme Lord of Original Sin, Supreme Lord Matthias, Supreme Lord Immortal, and the others looked on with an expression of gratitude. They once lost all hope of winning this war. Hence they were immensely grateful and relieved to win this war in such a manner. They could proudly admit that it was all because of Zen's bravery. So much so that the efforts of the Supreme Lords were almost insignificant. The Grand Supreme Lord of the sacred race looked completely shocked at the spectacle that unfolded in front of him. He was the highest-ranking Supreme Lord in the sacred race, and also the possessor of the heavens-suppressing object. In the Murphy universe, he even had the ability to communicate with Murphy, who was the creator. The entire universe was the sole creation of Murphy, including the Grand Supreme Lord. He never thought that Murphy and the sacred race would fail so miserably. However, now that the situation had developed to this point, the chances they had vanished into thin air. Chapter 17:15, Holy Being's Sword Strike. The Grand Supreme Lord of the sacred race and other sacred Supreme Lords were all shocked and upset. Displeased expressions were revealed in their faces. The dozen or so sacred Supreme Lords stood there still like blocks of wood. All of their minds were in chaos. The head of the celestial position race, Master Feng, stood formidably on the evolution lotus flower. The evolution lotus flower continued to spin around and floated towards the Grand Supreme Lord of the sacred race. The eyes of the head of the celestial position race flickered as he looked at the Grand Supreme Lord. He then asked with an arrogant tone, "Are you guys going to kill yourselves here, or are you trying to struggle in vain?" The Grand Supreme Lord lifted his head and looked at the head of the celestial position race with a complicated expression in his eyes. Despair seemed to have enveloped him. Meanwhile, the spinulose wood fern behind him was already dark and without light. As the Grand Supreme Lord of the sacred race, his best course of action was to let everyone escape back to the Murphy universe. However, would they be able to survive such a miserable situation? Suddenly, a strange sound rang out. The mysterious sound echoed throughout the area. Pop, pop, pop. The sound was like that made by a woodpecker when it continuously knocked against a hollow tree. It seemed like the noise came from all directions. Everyone present could hear it clearly. However, they could not find the source of the sound. Pop, pop, pop. The sound continued to reverberate. Soon, both Zen and Lavender raised their heads and looked up at the same time. All of the Supreme Lords present at the area also looked up. Their eyes continued to search for the source of the noise. The mysterious sound actually came from high above the sky of the evolutionary universe. The height of the evolutionary universe was limited. It would undoubtedly have a boundary up in the sky. High above in the sky, the stars moved slow. A dark void lingered above the stars. At the very top of this void was the dome of the evolutionary universe. The dome was formed by the sighing wall to seal the evolutionary universe off from the outside world. The bottom of the universe was the deepest part of the lower world, while the dome was the highest part of the universe. The universe was so vast that the distance between the 2 points was 180 billion trillion miles. The mysterious voice came from such a far distance away. Not only the Supreme Lords but almost all of the creatures within the evolutionary universe heard the sound. Most of them focused their sights on the heavens. Countless mortals in 100,000 Supreme Worlds all raised their heads to stare at the sky. Frightened expressions decorated their faces as cold sweat trickled down their backs. Although the sound had no particular message, it still shook the entire universe. They were just like the crew of a large vessel, and anxiety would envelop anyone who suddenly heard strange noises from the ship they were at. Pop, pop, pop. What is that sound? Who's making that noise? Is someone playing a prank with a roaring token? We often hear the sound spreading from the roaring token. We're quite familiar with how it enters our minds. But this sound is completely different from the one that comes from a roaring token. The roaring token forced the voice into the ears of every living being through the law of causality. Even if one were to cover their ears, they would not be able to resist the sound from a roaring token. However, at that moment, the voice was transmitted from the dome of the universe. Supreme Lord of Oracle, Master Feng, Zen, and the rest also looked at each other in dismay. Bewilderment was apparent in their expressions as they were utterly clueless about what had just happened. Every creature was confused about the mysterious sound. The divine land was in an uproar at that time. Murphy, what are you doing? Are you courting death? Stop, Murphy, you can't break the rules. The power of the stone slab is unimaginable. Is Murphy insane? Ha ha, he's asking for it. Everyone, just ignore him. The voices of holy beings could be heard one after another. Different opinions reverberated throughout their discussion. Some holy beings mocked Murphy, some were surprised, some dissuaded him, and some tried their hardest to persuade him. All of their opinions were heard by Murphy. However, Murphy was not affected by them at all. Not long after, a crack appeared in the dome of the evolutionary universe. A long zigzag line suddenly appeared with a dark premonition on the dome. The sighing wall, which was over 1,000 miles thick and extremely sturdy, actually cracked. No one had thought that such a thing would be possible. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of the sighing wall breaking spread throughout the evolutionary universe. It was like the noise made by the keel of a massive ship when it was torn apart. Panic and confusion caused everyone's heart to palpitate. As the sound continued, the crack on the dome relentlessly grew bigger for millions of miles. The bright light of the sighing wall reflected off the crack. Countless mortals in the 100,000 supreme worlds discovered that a strange star appeared in the sky. The mysterious star was far larger than any ordinary star. Similar to a giant spider that lay with dangerous intentions, the star settled suspiciously in the sky. Bang! A thunderous noise was heard by everyone. As the entire evolutionary universe began to shake, a voice came out from the crack in the dome of the evolutionary universe. Everything shook as the voice reverberated through the evolutionary universe. The voice was solemn as if it could command all living things and control everyone's life and death. No matter who you are, just go to perdition. Splash! Suddenly, a beam of soft light flashed from the crack in the dome. It was a cross-shaped sword light. The cross-shaped sword light seemed to possess the power to destroy the worlds. Without any delay, the sword light hacked down towards Zen from above. Along the way, the sword light collided with many stars. However, as soon as the sword light touched the stars, they would be completely destroyed. Without any exception, the stars were obliterated by the sword light. This is. After he looked at the ray of sword light, the head of the celestial position race took a deep breath. This is troublesome. A holy being has finally taken action, Blade said as he frowned. Distress was apparent in his eyes. Additionally, he also once again made a guess at what had really happened. Once a war between two universes began, it was almost impossible for holy beings in the two universes to meddle in the war. The stone slab with the rules recorded on it was not just for show. The rules were supposed to be followed by everyone in the divine land, even the holy beings. Once the rules were broken, even a holy being would be punished and pay a heavy price. Blade had also heard of the feud between Murphy and Mike. Even if these two holy beings were mortal enemies, there was no need for Murphy to be in such a rush. However, Murphy badly desired Zen's death, and even the terror from the punishment of the stone slab was not enough to discourage him. The punishment must be considered dangerous and risky to his own life. Since Murphy willingly accepted the punishment of the stone slab in order to kill Zen, then there must be a hidden reason behind his actions. Does the holy being really make a move? Everyone, run away. Where should we go? Can we even escape a holy being's attack? All of the supreme lords present were shocked by the scene. Nervousness had already crippled their hearts. When the war began, the supreme lords considered themselves the protagonists of the war. However, it was not long before they realized that it was the disciples of the holy beings, the true gods, who decided the victory or defeat of the war. In the end, they finally understood that they were only mere pawns in the catastrophic war. Who would have thought that even the holy being would get involved now? The supreme lords thought of themselves as mere ants in a storm. Holy Murphy, plop, the grand supreme lord knelt on the ground all of a sudden. His face was painted with submission to authority. The dim and gloomy Spinulo's wood fern seemed to sense Murphy's aura. At that moment, waves of precious light constantly flashed within the trunk of the tree. Plop, plop, plop. The supreme lords of the sacred race knelt down one after another. Murphy was the god of creation in the Murphy universe. His existence was also the faith of all the members of the sacred race. It was only at that moment that they realized that Murphy hadn't abandoned them. The holy being himself had personally made a move. Since the holy being was forced to take action, would the Murphy universe still have a chance of victory? Boom, boom, boom. As the cross-shaped sword right continued to descend, more and more stars collided with it. Naturally, the number of stars that were shattered by the sword light increased as well. Thunderous sounds of explosions resounded throughout the entire universe. Each explosion brought fear into the hearts of the creatures that heard it. Zen raised his head to look at the sky and remained motionless. The cross-shaped sword light reflected in his black eyes. He knew that he could not avoid the sword light, and the sword strike from a holy being was not so easy to dodge. Conviction was apparent in his eyes. Then he said calmly, "Lavender, you should leave here now." When Lavender heard Zen's words, she suddenly grabbed Zen's hand. Moisture began to invade her eyes as she shook her head. "I'm not leaving. It's meaningless to die here with me," Zen said resolutely. His expression was accompanied by intense yet merciful eyes. His father had speculated a lot of things and left enough trump cards to help Zen win the war. But he had never thought that Murphy would personally take action. Such a rash action was unforeseen. However, even if Mike had predicted that Murphy would act, he could still do nothing about it. Helplessness would cripple him. After all, currently, Mike was no different from a dead man. He couldn't fight against another holy being. "Alas, I didn't want to reveal my real body here, but it seems like I have no other choice. This unusual circumstance has forced me to do this." A faint voice suddenly sounded out in the ears of all the Supreme Lords. The voice contained a mysterious quality that left an impression they could never forget for the rest of their lives. Suddenly, the woman in blue clothes appeared in front of Zen. A beautiful face partnered by a slim figure made the woman irresistibly gorgeous. She looked at Zen with a resentful expression. "Why did you ask me for help before? Why don't you ask for help now? Are you afraid that I cannot withstand the holy being's sword strike?" Zen stared at the woman in blue and smiled faintly. Afterward, he showed a callous expression and replied honestly, "Yes. You just underestimate me too much." The woman in blue shook her head. A pout was seen in her delicate lips. She then looked towards the sky. "I am not a match for the holy being, but it shouldn't be difficult for me to block this sword strike." After they saw her appear suddenly, all of the Supreme Lords were shocked once more. They couldn't believe that she would attempt to block the holy being's sword strike. Wasn't the woman in blue way too arrogant? Chapter 17:16. Estelle She. The moment the blue-clothed woman appeared, another commotion broke out in the dense fog deep within the Divine Land. These holy beings were the strongest existences within the Divine Land. They had lived for hundreds of thousands of years and were rarely surprised by anything. But now, every holy being in the Hall of Holy Beings were utterly dumbfounded. As they gasped, their voices were full of great surprise, as if the appearance of this woman in the evolutionary universe was inconceivable. "This woman isn't she Estelle She? This is unbelievable. Estelle is actually still alive. Why would she appear in the evolutionary universe? Didn't she disappear after she took over the Soul Wilderness? Holy Zachariah even went into the depths of the Soul Wilderness to search for her. Not only did he find nothing, but his life vitality weakened considerably once he came out of the Soul Wilderness." This blue-clothed girl was named Estelle She, a legendary figure in the Divine Land. She was also the only true god that had stepped into the depths of the Soul Wilderness and taken control of it. Ruling the Soul Wilderness was an unimaginable feat, even for a holy being. But Estelle She had done it, which was why it was not an exaggeration for Estelle She to be called the #1 woman in the Divine Land. The woman had also attracted the attention of some holy beings. One of them was Zachariah Jian, who was also known as Holy Zachariah. In the past, Estelle She had hidden in the Soul Wilderness where even holy beings couldn't enter easily. Holy Zachariah had searched for her in the Soul Wilderness several times but to no avail. What was worse, he had encountered a lot of troubles in the Soul Wilderness and as a result, his life vitality had depleted greatly. He had to return to the Hall of Holy Beings to recuperate for 2 divine eras before recovering completely. There were some forbidden places in the Divine Land that even holy beings could not recklessly break into. A few other holy beings were also searching for this woman. She had something to do with a very important secret of the Soul Wilderness. Several divine eras ago, Estelle She had suddenly disappeared from the Divine Land. Even holy beings had failed to find her. There had been rumors that Estelle She had escaped from the Divine Land and stepped into the endless chaos outside it. There were also rumors that she had died. These rumors had been circulating for many years, but they gradually faded away with the passage of time. It was only when some true gods roamed the Soul Wilderness that they would occasionally mention the woman who once controlled the Soul Wilderness. After all, before her, not even a holy being had been able to control the Soul Wilderness. Estelle She was gradually being forgotten and became history. But the holy beings had surprisingly good memories. They would remember every single detail of the past. So the moment Estelle She appeared on the scene, every holy being in the Hall of Holy Beings was puzzled. Just where did this woman pop out from? Had she been hiding in the evolutionary universe this entire time? A tall, middle-aged man was standing outside the dome of the evolutionary universe. This man was dressed in a golden coat armor and held the mantra sword in his hand. His eyes glinted gently, just like the light on the spinulous wood fern, only purer and thicker. This was Murphy, the holy Murphy. His anger simmered down a little the moment he used the mantra sword to strike. He had spent a lot of effort to break through the sighing wall and had sent out many sacred supreme lords into the war. He had exhausted so much momentum and countless resources in order to change the rules on the stone slab and to send 3 of his disciples to fight the war. In the end, he still had to take action himself. This strike was enough to destroy Mike's hopes. But he would have to pay a huge price in exchange for it. Even a holy being would not dare violate the rules on the stone slab, because they would then have to accept the punishment from the slab. But it was completely worth it. Mike was like a centipede that did not topple over even when dead. Murphy was still afraid of Mike's counterattack. If he were to cut off the most important link, Mike's entire plan would be shattered. Only by doing this would he be able to rest easy. In the depths of the Hall of Holy Beings and on the edge of a shoal by the Time Sea, stood a stone slab that was 10,000 feet high. The stone slab was engraved with a number of small characters, some of which were ordinary characters, but there were also a few that were in golden-colored Sanskrit. It was this stone slab that had recorded the large and small rules of the entire divine land. These rules were different from the laws on the Godly Way tablets. The rules on the stone slab were like the laws of the entire divine land. They couldn't be disobeyed or violated, not even by the holy beings. Holy beings could formulate and modify the rules to a certain extent, but they would still have to pay a considerable price. For example, Murphy had changed a rule so that 3 true gods could be sent to fight the war between the universes. When Murphy had shattered the sighing wall of the evolutionary universe and slashed through the dome with his sword, an azure bolt of lightning had appeared on the stone slab. This lightning seemed ordinary. Any martial artist who had comprehended the first layer of the thunder law could achieve that. But even a holy being would be afraid of this lightning that emerged from this stone slab. The azure lightning instantly shot out with a crack, forming a lightning chain. It rushed out of the Time Sea, passing through the Hall of Holy Beings and all the big and small floating islands that the clans of holy beings inhabited, and headed straight for Murphy. Murphy was instantly bound by this lightning chain. Murphy didn't resist. He knew that he couldn't defy the punishment of the stone slab. When he had shattered the dome of the evolutionary universe, he had been ready to accept punishment. But now that he was bound by the lightning chain, the blue-clothed woman had suddenly appeared within his field of vision. Estelle. Murphy's eyes widened as panic began to take place within their depths. He was blanking out, because he hadn't expected this to happen. He watched as she opened her arms, flowers blooming around her, dancing in the air, and forming a grand array that stretched for 10,000 miles around her. Was she trying to stop his strike? No, no, Estelle, what do you want? We can talk, but you can't stop me. Murphy roared, his voice ringing out of the dome of the evolutionary universe. He wanted to break free of the lightning chain and rush into the evolutionary universe. But the lightning that had shot out of the stone slab had an absolute binding power in the divine land. Even if he was a holy being, he had no chance of breaking free. No, no, despite his constant growling, the lightning chain eventually dragged him away. But his voice still echoed within the evolutionary universe. The holy being's final roar filled the hearts of all the secondary creatures in the evolutionary universe with wariness. A mysterious smile played on Estelle's lips as she looked at the dome of the evolutionary universe. I'm sorry, Holy Murphy. I didn't mean to make things difficult for you. I was enslaved and controlled by Zen, she said. Murphy obviously couldn't hear her. If he could, he would be furious. The next moment, a sea of flowers surrounded the woman. As she made a gesture in which her fingers were shaped like an orchid and waved her hands, the petals began to dance in the air. They formed into a tornado of petals that faced Murphy's sword slash. The power behind Murphy's strike was no joke. Anyone who touched the sword radiance would be destroyed instantly. The same was true for the beautiful petals. The moment the soft petals touched the sword radiance, they disappeared without a trace. However, the petals left dark spots the size of a copper coin on the wide sword radiance. Each petal could leave a dark spot, and such a large number of petals were like a rain of petals rushing towards the sword radiance. The sword radiance had eliminated the petals, but the petals were also eroding the sword radiance. As the two strong powers clashed, the petals scattered, and the gigantic sword radiance began to shrink rapidly like a piece of ice in summer. The ray of sword radiance had an astonishing momentum. When it was 1,000,000 miles away from Zen, there was only half the sword radiance left. When it was 300,000 miles away, more than half of it had been eroded by the petals, leaving only a third of the original. When the sword radiance was 100,000 miles away, it was only 1/10 of what it originally had been. And when it finally landed in front of Zen, the petals had already wrapped around Zen. At this moment, the sword radiance was only a 100 millionth of the original in the size of a finger. Its power was negligible. But it still landed on Zen's forehead. Chapter 17:17, Comprehension. Although the power of the sword light that was only a few inches long was not great, the sword light was still exceptionally sharp when activated by the mantra sword and used by a holy being. It actually cut open the space between Zen's eyebrows, leaving a gaping wound 3 inches long on his forehead. Splash! Golden blood gushed out freely from Zen's forehead. The 3-inch-long sword light was just about to cut into Zen's bone and brain. At the side, as Estelle extended her hand, a jade light flashed and blocked the sword light. Then, she waved one hand around the sword light, and a speck of jade light flowed out from her nimble fingers and formed a jade-colored ball of light, trapping the 3-inch-long sword light inside. However, Lavender, who stayed close by, made a sad face. You can obviously eliminate this sword light, but why did you leave behind this section of light and let it injure Zen? Although Zen was injured, this wound was clearly not a major injury. However, Lavender still felt sorry for him. After Estelle glanced at Lavender, she turned to say to Zen, "You are a sword cultivator, and the sword intent contained in Murphy's mantra Godly Way is also extremely powerful. This sword strike landed on your forehead, allowing you to comprehend the true intent of the swordsmanship. The extent of your comprehension will depend on your own ability. If a holy being were to make a move, it would send shock waves throughout the entire world. Perhaps no one would be able to survive the holy being's sword attack." On top of that, Murphy launched the sword strike with his full strength this time. However, Estelle decided upon an artful method to resolve it. She even left the 3-inch-long sword light for Zen to understand. When Zen heard what Estelle said, his heart missed a beat. He hadn't progressed in his comprehension of the swordsmanship for a long time, nor had he even been able to progress on the emotion-closing godly way. This was one of Zen's bottlenecks. With a flick of Estelle's finger, the ball of light floated to a position in front of Zen. Just now, when Zen's forehead was cut open, what followed was not an ice-cold sword intent, but an extremely gentle sword intent. The sword intent that Zen had comprehended before had been extremely sharp and fierce, and Zen had cultivated the emotion-closing godly way, which pursued the ultimate sharpness. Therefore, the emotion-closing godly way required one to put aside all their emotions and to possess an undisturbed heart. Only in this way were they able to launch the most powerful sword strike. As for Murphy's swordsmanship, it was completely different from any ordinary swordsmanship. It was in every way extremely inclusive. What he pursued was not the ultimate sharpness, but consummation. Make a complicated thing simple. Turn a simple thing into something more complicated. Zen's forehead twitched and he could tell that the wound was rapidly healing. Zen could only feel that he had caught on to some important points. However, these points seemed to be hidden in the mist, making it difficult for him to grasp them clearly. Estelle smiled slightly. It is great when you can comprehend something after being cut by the sword. However, don't think that you can rely on the 3-inch-long sword light to completely comprehend Murphy's swordsmanship. That is wishful thinking. The sword light can still be kept in my time cage for a period of time, so hurry up and comprehend it yourself. Zen simply nodded. If a martial artist wanted to break through their bottleneck, they must go through many years of cultivation, or else they had to gain epiphany by going through hundreds of battles. It was certainly wishful thinking for Zen to intend to completely comprehend the swordsmanship after just being hit by the sword strike. However, his previous comprehension had indeed yielded some benefits for him. The 3-inch-long sword light was extremely useful to his swordsmanship. Therefore, he carefully stored the jade-colored ball of light away. The woman in blue who had suddenly appeared had disintegrated Murphy's sword strike. This surprised the Supreme Lords in the universe and the Sacred Supreme Lords, and they were all speechless. The woman chatted freely with Zen. Besides her beautiful face and her mysterious attractiveness, there didn't seem to be anything special about her appearance. However, every Supreme Lord who looked at her had a face filled with great reverence. For some reason this woman was incredibly scary. Even Master Feng and the others would not utter a single word. They were content to let Zen talk to her and discuss the plan of action. The Grand Supreme Lord of the sacred race was still kneeling on the ground. To behold their creator was the greatest possible honor for every sacred martial artist. But, Murphy's situation at this time caused them to fall into even greater despair. If even Holy Murphy could be blocked by this woman, then what hope did the sacred race have now? The Grand Supreme Lord and the remaining sacred Supreme Lords behind him slowly rose to their feet. After the Grand Supreme Lord had licked his dry lips, he said softly, we lost, but the mission given to us by Holy Murphy must still be continued. He told us to pay attention to the godly geniuses in the evolutionary universe, they are of supreme importance. Now I understand. He was referring to the most important person. And only that one. The Supreme World fragment under the feet of the Grand Supreme Lord of the Sacred Race was moving away from Zen and the others. Although they were separated by a great distance and the Grand Supreme Lord did not point out the most important person, the Sacred Supreme Lords behind him clearly understood that the Grand Supreme Lord was referring to Zen. This person was crucial. Just now, Murphy had tried with all his might to kill this young man, but he was not able to do it. Now that the Sacred Race had totally lost the war, their last purpose was to find a way to kill Zen. All of the Sacred Supreme Lords present knew that this was an impossible mission. What they were actually pursuing was just a worthy death. Kill, the Grand Supreme Lord spoke. The surviving Sacred Supreme Lords also exploded with the strong killing intent as they unleashed their own treasures and heavenly destiny. Blood-colored space laws were formed. After they employed the grand teleportation technique, they all rushed towards Zen. Are these guys really that anxious to die? Blade chuckled as he stood up. They aren't qualified to fight even when their lives are on the line. Supreme Lord of Oracle raised her eyebrows. The entire Humanity Alliance had been destroyed in the Sacred Race's invasion. Thus she really hated the Sacred Supreme Lords. They just want a decent way to die, so let's kill them, Master Feng uttered, correctly interpreting the Grand Supreme Lord's thoughts. The path of martial arts was a road filled with helplessness. Even the true gods in the divine land could do nothing of their own free wills. True, they could be immortal, without being fettered by their lifespan, but in the end, even greater shackles were placed on them. The last wave of attacks from the Sacred Supreme Lords were directed straight at Zen. Unfortunately for them, just as they executed the grand teleportation technique, they were blocked by Master Feng and the others. After that, Blade activated his fighting intent and joined the fray. In this situation, the Sacred Supreme Lords were at a distinct disadvantage. As the heavens of the Murphy universe continued to shake, all of the remaining Supreme Lords fell to the ground and died. The shock of the heavens was originally transmitted only through the heavenly destiny, and was only detected by the Supreme Lords. When the Grand Supreme Lord died, Blade also smashed the Spinulose wood fern to pieces. Although the heavens-suppressing object that the Grand Supreme Lord controlled was not the true form of the Spinulose wood fern, it still had a great impact on the Murphy universe. Under the crazy vibration of the heavens, all of the sacred martial artists in the Murphy universe could sense it. From that point onwards, not one Supreme Lord remained in the Murphy universe. However, the loss of the Supreme Lords of the Murphy universe wasn't a major blow to Murphy. After dissipating, the heavenly destiny would automatically return to the heavens and appear again in some form in the Murphy universe. For example, the heavenly destiny in the evolutionary universe took the form of the crown of destiny, and the heavenly destiny in the Murphy universe would appear in some corner of the universe in the form of the heavenly destiny seed. However, the entire sacred race's force had been stable for countless years. With the retraction of the heavenly destiny, the sacred race could start to experience intense internal strife and upheaval. That wasn't what Murphy wanted to see. Chapter 17:18, The Bicker. All of the remaining Supreme Lords of the sacred race had perished. This meant none other than the end of the Universal War. To the evolutionary universe, this war was still a massive calamity. Countless Supreme Worlds had been shattered, countless kingdoms had been destroyed, and it was hard to even estimate the number of warriors that had been killed. All the same though, like the aftermath of a forest fire, destruction also meant rebirth. Here, in the evolutionary universe, there were only 30-odd remaining Supreme Lords across all the land. In other words, there were over 90 current vacancies for Supreme Lords. It was true that quite a high number of evolutionary universes' World Lords had lost their lives in the battle, but the overall number of World Lords was still good. The remaining 200,000 World Lords would strive to fight for the Supreme Lord position. That said, fighting for a position as a Supreme Lord was far from easy. After all, bearing the crown of destiny required time, and the Supreme Lords within the evolutionary universe weren't yet completely dead. In fact, it was highly plausible that the distribution of over 90 crowns of destiny was still controlled by the remaining 30-odd Supreme Lords. Due to the sacred race invasion, all present Supreme Lords had dropped their prejudices. When it came to the interests of their own race though, the chances of conflict lingering between them were still great. Given the fact that these Supreme Lords had passed through such a disastrous event together, the distribution of the crowns of destiny should no longer resort to force. It was now more likely than ever that it would be resolved through negotiation. It wasn't long before Master Feng used the roaring token in order to announce the victory to the entire universe. When Master Feng's voice echoed throughout the universe, the evolution lotus flower became heavy once again. The momentum contained within the voice had more than doubled. All the intelligent creatures in the evolutionary universe began to celebrate. Joy pervaded every mortal royal court, every temple, street, countless sacred places and divine kingdoms. Not only were the intelligent beings affected by the atmosphere, but so were a few of the savage beasts, rare insects and plants. Heck, even the regular mountains and rivers seemed to be exuding a refreshing aura. This victory belonged to the entire universe, and this world was alive and thriving. As Zen lay on a supreme world fragment, a sense of relief washed over him. In order to survive this universal crisis, he had been extremely busy for dozens of years. Fortunately though, the result wasn't half bad at all. Although Zen also understood that this was the end for everyone in the evolutionary universe, he knew his life was truly about to begin. Now, he had to jump out of this universe and face the real enemy. Speaking of which, he wasn't the only one who needed to jump out of the universe. The other godly geniuses were actually obliged to make this same choice. Margaret. As Zen stood up, a thought flashed through his mind and his eyebrows rose slightly. A few seconds ago, for safety's sake, Supreme Lord Lester had left with Margaret's and Nathan's bodies in tow. Although Zen was very confident in Supreme Lord Lester, he didn't know how things were going to play out. Crack! Out of nowhere, a space crack suddenly appeared. From the crack emerged an agile figure. A pair of embroidered shoes tapped the air a few times before a woman pounced instantly into Zen's arms. Ah, I really thought I was going to die this time. Margaret cried in Zen's arms. Not far away, the Supreme Lords looked at each other as they observed the scene. Lavender rubbed at her delicate ears and looked away with her red, somewhat puffy eyes. She was the one who had stayed the longest with Zen, and had long become accustomed to Margaret's appearance. After being wrapped up tightly and hugged like an octopus, Zen felt rather embarrassed and a little helpless, at first. It was inappropriate to be intimate with Margaret in front of the Supreme Lords, but seconds later, he seemed to have understood something. With a faint smile, he held onto Margaret tightly. It was precisely because of her sincerity that Margaret came off as totally adorable. And Zen was in no position to ask her to change. However, just as Zen grasped onto her waist, she struggled out of his embrace and her shallow eyebrows immediately knitted themselves into a frown. She glared at the blue-clothed woman behind Zen and questioned him, "Zen, who is this woman? Where does she come from?" Margaret had very developed senses and was likely to feel enmity toward any female that was around Zen. It would have been fine if the blue-clothed woman was very ordinary, but this woman gave her a very special feeling. She immediately sensed that this woman was powerful and mysterious. Margaret had gone from a docile little sheep just a moment ago and transformed into a vicious lioness. This woman was the reason. Margaret's actions had scared Master Feng and the others, though. None Supreme Lords present were capable of seeing through this blue-clothed woman's cultivation base. This woman was a terrifying character that could resist even Murphy's sword strike. They didn't doubt that with her ability alone, she could slaughter all of the Supreme Lords present in the blink of an eye. Such formidable masters were usually temperamental. They had a chance of winning this war all because the woman helped them at a crucial moment. If they angered her though, she might not let them get away that easily. Master Feng, Supreme Lord of Oracle and the others were all heavy-hearted and felt an overwhelming desire to cry. "Margaret, don't speak nonsense. This lady has saved our lives," Master Feng snapped, with an unprecedented sternness. Although Margaret belonged to the celestial position, Master Feng had always treated her with a kind attitude, just like a grandfather would. He treated her in such a way in order to make her control the god's killing sword array. Despite that though, his sudden seriousness came off as a surprise, and it stunned Margaret for a short moment. Faced with this situation, any other women, Lucille included, would have shut up immediately. After all, it was better to be sensible and get the priorities straight, right? Margaret, on the other hand, was quite different. After being scolded by Master Feng, she pouted and quickly responded, "So what if she saved our lives? Saving our lives means she can steal my man afterward. If we follow that line of thought, Supreme Lord Lester has also saved me, can he steal my man, too?" Ha ha. Lavender, who was nearly always serious, couldn't contain herself and laughed out loud. Blade wanted to laugh too, but he didn't dare. Among all the people here, he was the only one who was absolutely clear on how terrifying this blue-clothed woman truly was. As for those Supreme Lords, their faces had completely darkened. A few of them were now cautiously sizing up Estelle, afraid that this woman would anger quickly. Margaret, Zen shouted. Zen felt that his only option was to try and stop Margaret before she grew more and more boisterous. Am I wrong? Margaret questioned, wrinkling her brow. At first, Zen wanted to reprimand her with an even harsher tone, but when he thought of how she had just been resurrected, his heart softened and he became speechless instead. Once Murphy's 3-inch sword radiance was sealed off, Estelle kept looking upward, as if she was observing something in the sky. Upon hearing Margaret's words though, she recovered her senses. As she cast an indifferent glance at Margaret, her face immediately cracked a mysterious smile like a blooming cyan lotus, exuding an attraction that was almost fatal to any man who dared look in her direction. The supreme lords here were much more experienced than the emperors of the mortal world. The women by their sides were all stunning beauties, and many of them were even more outstanding than this blue-clothed woman. However, once they reached the Soul Sea realm, it was quite easy to change their appearances, which then became unimportant. Despite that, this woman's temperament made all the present supreme lords flip out. Even Supreme Lord of Oracle, who was a woman, was no exception. Estelle smiled faintly while taking 2 slow steps toward Margaret. Her brown eyes seemed to have countless souls circulating within them. She was the controller of the soul wilderness, and no one could surpass her study in soul throughout the whole of the divine land. With just a glance, she seemed to have the capacity to suck in Margaret's soul. Before the blue-clothed woman, Margaret felt naked, completely exposed. Amidst her nervousness, she retreated behind Zen. Lady, Margaret is straightforward and outspoken. Please forgive her, Zen uttered, clasping his hands together. Although he didn't know this mysterious blue-clothed woman at all, deep in his heart, Zen didn't feel as though she had any ill intentions toward him. He knew she wasn't a mean person overall, and this was just a small matter, so Zen wasn't very nervous. Never mind, I just have something I want to tell her, Estelle responded unexpectedly, with a cold smile on her face. So what if I steal your man? As soon as these words were spoken, not only was Zen stunned, but the other supreme lords present were equally taken aback. Even Blade was dumbfounded at this reply. She really is the #1 extraordinary woman in all the divine land. She can say such words. But, your man is still a little too inexperienced, Estelle uttered lightly. Now, I don't have much interest in him, but who knows if my interest will change in the future. After that, she lightly swiped her pinky across Zen's forehead where the wound had nearly completely healed, leaving only a small cut. With her touch, the cut quickly disappeared. Everything happened so quickly that even Zen himself hadn't noticed that a tiny petal had quietly been planted inside the wound. Chapter 17-19, Wedding. Margaret was afraid of the woman in front of her. However, after she saw the woman's actions, Margaret felt like the woman coveted something that belonged to her. With a pout on her lips, she craned her head to peer from behind Zen's back. A vicious expression was displayed in Margaret's face as she glared at the blue-clothed woman. After she planted that petal, Estelle seemed to have lost her interest with Margaret. Estelle decided to stop her pranks against the pitiful lady. She said to Zen indifferently, I can't leave the evolutionary universe now. Why don't you let me return to that fairy palace? Estelle had had to block Murphy's strike, for which she had exposed herself. Those holy beings didn't dare to enter the evolutionary universe directly. However, if she left through the crack at the top of the evolutionary universe, it would lead to endless trouble. She would be in a bad situation. Once she returned to the fairy palace, Estelle would be able to leave through the swirl forest. Naturally, Zen would agree to this request of Estelle. However, he still asked doubtfully, but the enchanted barrier around my fairy palace has yet to be opened. Are you able to pass through that enchanted barrier? Zen even raised an eyebrow as he asked his question. The entire fairy palace was covered in a special enchanted barrier. Although Zen had already obtained 7 tokens, he still had 1 more to get from the true path. He had yet attained complete control of the fairy palace. As such, he couldn't remove the enchanted barrier. Moreover, Zen's current cultivation wasn't at the level of a godly genius. He could still improve his strength. As for the swirl forest, where the fairy palace was located, it was indeed somewhere in the divine land. Once that enchanted barrier was removed, it would bring about an unpredictable effect. Chaotic chain reactions would be triggered. For example, Zen might directly be disintegrated and turn into a ball of life vitality and disappear entirely. That enchanted barrier can stop the other people. However, it can't stop me, Estelle said as she shook her head slightly. Obviously, her spiteful remark referred to Blade, Big Mouth Wayne, and Master Evil. I get it, Zen nodded his head. Since the blue-clothed woman was in a hurry to leave, she obviously had a reason to be in a rush. Zen extended his hand and bowed deeply. With a grateful voice, He said, Master, I thank you on behalf of my father for helping the evolutionary universe pass through such a crisis. As they saw Zen's gratitude, Master Feng and the other Supreme Lords also bowed towards Estelle. Their acknowledgement was in their expressions. The kindness of hers was not something that the people present could repay. They could only thank her verbally. Estelle accepted their gratitude with a smile. She then turned to Zen and said, I feel like you owe me a huge favor. In the future, you must repay me. Of course, your compassionate actions are unrepayable by the current me. However, if I can get into the divine land in the future and achieve something, I will definitely give you my all. Zen rather liked this woman since she was open and upright. He immediately asked with a curious face, but I still don't know your name. However, Estelle simply smiled and answered with a sweet tone, Are you not my master? With my enslaving token in your hands, you can investigate everything in my soul at any time. Why do you have to ask me my name instead of just investigating it in my soul? I said that I would not peep into your secrets. I will keep my word, Zen firmly replied. His expression was similar to a gallant knight. Estelle slightly raised her elegant eyebrows as she sent a flirtatious gaze towards Zen. A blush even painted her cheeks. With a trace of incomprehension in her eyes, she said, All right, let me go back. Only then did Zen take out the token of mountain and place her within his fairy palace. As for how to pass through the enchanted barrier and leave the fairy palace, that was the blue-clothed girl's business. Zen had finally granted the blue-clothed girl her wish. After Estelle had disappeared, Margaret was finally able to express her anger. With a reddened face, she said hatefully, That seductive vixen. The moment the words left her mouth, the crowd of Supreme Lords broke out in a cold sweat once again. They were shocked and frightened by Margaret's emotional outburst. Even though the powerful woman had already left, she might still be able to hear them. What if she came back and felt offended? The Supreme Lords waited for the woman in blue to smite them out of anger. Fortunately, the Supreme Lords' worries did not happen. Margaret looked at everyone's expressions and immediately felt bored. As such, she quickly fixed her gaze on Lavender. Hey! Aren't you angry? Lavender did not pay any attention to Margaret. She callously rolled her eyes, then turned her body to the other side and didn't even give Margaret a single look. However, Margaret was persistent. She continued to ask with a bold tone, You must be jealous, why don't you show it? You should express your thoughts more freely. It's not good for a woman to hold back her emotions. As she was continuously nagged by Margaret, Lavender became utterly helpless. With her personality, she would probably directly attack if it was another person that annoyed her. As he watched Lavender's expression grew more and more impatient, Zen could only forcefully drag Margaret to another side. Supreme Lord of Original Sin saw Margaret was safely sent back by Supreme Lord Lester with mixed feelings. Certainly, he knew that Supreme Lord Lester was continuously using all his strength to revive Nathan. He was naturally somewhat nervous, but he could not go and disturb him. Right at that moment, another space crack appeared, and Supreme Lord Lester walked out of the space crack. The eyes of Supreme Lord of Original Sin flickered as he asked nervously, Is Nathan? Before his voice had even faded, a figure floated out from the space crack. Supreme Lord of Original Sin gawked. It was Nathan himself. But compared to what he looked before, Nathan looked rather weak when he appeared from the space crack. His face was pale, and he did not have the slightest bit of vitality. But when Margaret was revived by the heavenly destiny of revival, she was lively and full of energy. Father. Nathan bowed and also became excited when he saw Supreme Lord of Original Sin. Just like Margaret, he had thought that he would be dead already. Despair and hopelessness enveloped him as he never thought that he would see the sun again. There is no need to greet right now. You silly boy, it is good to see that you are alive. Supreme Lord of Original Sin stepped forward and hugged Nathan. In the entire Xuanyuan clan, he had treated Nathan with the most care. At first, Supreme Lord of Original Sin no longer held any hope to Nathan's revival. However, now that Nathan was healed, Supreme Lord of Original Sin felt comforted and let out a grateful sigh. Because Nathan had been killed by Maha, he wasn't aware of any of the conflicts in the universe. But after he heard some details from Supreme Lord Lester, his look at that time towards Zen was completely different. Previously, Nathan had gradually been convinced that Zen was his equal and treated him as a friend. However, after the events, Nathan was utterly in awe of Zen. As far as the other godly geniuses were concerned, no one was qualified to participate in the battle between the Supreme Lords. Rocher continued to cultivate arduously, while Lucille and Lawson hid. The other godly geniuses were also in closed-door training. Each of them planned to improve their strengths before they engaged in the war. On the other hand, not only had Zen defeated Maha, but he had also killed a significant number of supreme lords of the sacred race. Such feats were extremely extraordinary. What was more shocking was that this guy could actually participate in a battle between true gods. Zen was spectacular in the eyes of Nathan. That was no longer a simple matter of being the strongest in the evolutionary universe. Zen became the key to the outcome of the battle. And as he looked at Zen, Nathan's mind was filled with worship and admiration. "Thank you," Nathan said with a smile. Grateful eyes decorated his face. He also knew that his life had been revived with Zen's help. However, his body had been destroyed to an extreme extent. Even though Supreme Lord Lester had used the heavenly destiny of revival to revive him, his cinnabar field was still slightly damaged. Such harm was probably an irreversible injury to ordinary warriors. Nevertheless, to a member of the Xuanyuan clan, it was not too big of a problem. It was still possible for Nathan to fully recover. Blade didn't head to the fairy palace. The destination he had in mind was somewhere else. After he bid farewell to Zen, Blade fled to a high place in the deep sky of the evolutionary universe. He escaped from a crack in the sighing wall that Murphy had smashed. As a member of the War God Hall, he did not have the same worry as Estelle. After the remaining Supreme Lords agreed to meet again, they all returned to their own territories. Each of them had to address the damages incurred by the war to their Supreme Worlds. Although all of Supreme Lords of the sacred race had been completely exterminated, there were still many members of the sacred race that survived and hid within the evolutionary universe. The Supreme Lords led their own clansmen to complete the final round of extermination. Accompanied with great purpose, they searched diligently for any survivors from the enemy. Zen brought Lavender and Margaret with him to the Breaking Cloud sacred place. At last, they were finally reunited with Letitia, Jeffrey, Aura and the others. After everyone had survived the disaster, the various races had also launched their own special celebrations. The time of peace and happiness had lasted for quite a long time. During that time, Supreme Lord of Oracle led her clansmen to take over the lost territories of the Humanity Alliance. At the same time, under the influence of the heavens, vibration, the evolutionary universe's heavens gave birth to another crown of destiny. That particular crown of destiny was obtained by the thoughtless minds. However, in the end, it was handed over to the hidden spirit temple of the blessed Buddha land. It was a gesture of kindness. After all, during this war between the evolutionary universe and the Murphy universe, the loss of the blessed Buddha land was the most serious. Not only did it result in the death of one top-rank Supreme Lord, namely Supreme Lord of Thunder Punishment, but the other 4 Supreme Lords also perished at the same time. There was no remaining Supreme Lord in the blessed Buddha land after the war. Their defenses were weakened to a pathetic level. In the past, when such things happened, the other forces would be ready to make a move and try their best to divide up the blessed Buddha land. However, after the recent crisis, the different races had shown more mercy. All of them had a new appreciation for the lives of other creatures and started to cherish peace more. A year later, the Celestial Position race spread out their invitation letters and invited all the Supreme Lords in the evolutionary universe to gather in the Breaking Cloud sacred place. Additionally, there were also Grand World Lords of various races and Saint Lords of different sacred places who also went to the Supreme World of the Celestial Position race. Countless gifts and tokens were brought by each visitor. It was because Zen had kept his promise to marry Margaret. As such, a marvelous wedding was celebrated, and Margaret's dream had finally come true. After this wedding, he would officially be Zen's wife. Chapter 1720, Special Guests. The wedding of Zen and Margaret had been the liveliest day in the entire evolutionary universe. The existence of roaring tokens had already become a part of the tradition in expressing one's blessing. This was also known as the most extravagant method of conveying good wishes for a celebration. After all the other roaring tokens were disposable compared to Zen's roaring token. But on this auspicious day, the wishes and greetings for the husband and wife echoed throughout the universe. Today is the wedding day of Zen and Margaret. I, Leandro, on behalf of the Western Spirit Sacred Place wish you a long and happy marriage. We wish you a wonderful beginning, and love to last for a lifetime. May the coming years fill your lives with love and happiness. This is the blessing from Dragon Dust Sacred Place for Zen and Margaret. Bless them as unmovable and eternal, and may their lives flourish like luxuriant trees. We wish for the bride and groom, together with the heaven and earth, the sun and the moon, to continue to give out light and radiance. Quote. Waves of congratulations resounded all through the evolutionary universe. Servants in formal attire busily moved around with their own tasks in the Grand Hall. The Grand Hall was situated at the foot of the Breaking Cloud Mountain. Thousands of musicians were drumming in unity as melodious sounds of joyous music continuously wafted about. The supreme lords were mostly humble, keeping a low profile. The wealth and glory which mortals desired were things that weren't new to them. They had already experienced such grandeur, though it didn't stop them from enjoying the celebration. It was a fulfillment of promise. Zen never thought that it would be such a sumptuous wedding ceremony. As Margaret only wished for a more extravagant wedding, he could only accept and cooperate with the preparation. The ceremony had been arranged by the celestial position. Grandpa, this way. The person who spoke was the talent of the ethereal spirit sect in the central region, Brent. Brent looked different compared to the young and inexperienced him back then. He had already entered the life and death realm, and became the mainstay of the ethereal spirit sect. This time, he appeared more mature as he led Xander towards the entrance of the hall. With the powerful means of the celestial position, it wouldn't be difficult for them to usher the people from the central region to the upper world. Brent was very curious about everything that was going on around him, as it was the first time he had stepped into the upper world. Powerful Soul Sea Realm warriors. There are so many of them. And they are only guarding the entrance. Astonishment was shown on his face. On either side of the hall, standing in a row were 300 warriors in golden armors, and all of them were at the Soul Sea Realm. If any one of them were placed in the lower world, they would be titled as war kings or war emperors. However, at this moment, they were just placed as guards in this place. Even though Xander was only at the life and death realm, he had lived far longer than Brent. He had more or less known about the situation in the upper world. He was aware that the Soul Sea Realm powerful warriors, who claimed themselves kings or emperors in the lower world, were nothing in the upper world. Looking at the situation in reality, it still gave him a shock, but he was calm not to show the surprise expression on his face. An enormous number of guests attended the ceremony, reaching to 100,000 people. They were divided into several categories, and there was a special team in the celestial position that received them. The first class included the supreme lords of the various great races, as well as the new supreme lords of this year. The second class were the leaders of the great powers. The third class included the grand world lords. The fourth class included the saint lords of the 10th grade sacred places, followed by the fifth class consisting of ordinary world lords. The guests were then escorted to their seats according to the arrangement. Inside the hall, there was a square paved with jade and stone. Entering the square, Brent noticed the 10 towering jade pillars erected at the side of the square. It made him confused. What are these pillars for? Hey, how ignorant, one of the warriors sneered. He casually sized up Brent and Xander, his face revealing a strange expression. Where did you two come from? How could two life and death realm little guys sneak in? To be called a little guy, it was still acceptable to Brent. However, for Xander, who was already over 1,000 years old, it was difficult in any matter to link him to the word, little. In the upper world, seniority was always measured by cultivation. Age was only secondary. Hearing this, Brent glared at the martial artist. It didn't matter if he was scolded, but since Xander had been offended, how could he bear it? What are you saying? Just as he finished his words, Xander waved his hand signaling him not to argue anymore and be quiet. Just now, Xander had examined the warrior, but he was unable to see through his cultivation. This meant that this warrior's cultivation was far above the Soul Sea realm. He knew that those present were all important figures. He was naturally afraid that Brent would impulsively offend them. The warrior who spoke to them was a world lord. In the eyes of a world lord, a life and death realm martial artist was someone who hadn't even crossed the threshold of learning martial arts. In the sacred place he governed, life and death realm warriors were still considered trainees. How dare the boy talk back at him? The warrior chuckled. Seeing you two sneaking around, I'm afraid that you are just trying to take advantage of the big scene and gain some profit. I will send you off on behalf of the celestial position. The warrior then stepped forward. With a casual wave of his hand, a space crack appeared in front of him. At once, he grabbed Brent and was about to stuff him into that space crack. The warrior was actually using the grand teleportation to drive them away. With this kind of cultivation, how could Brent and Xander possibly have any chance to resist? Right before he could throw them into the space crack, another space crack instantly appeared beside him. A cold voice rang out from within. Stop. The owner of the cold voice appeared, and it was actually Supreme Lord Mirage of the celestial position. The sudden appearance of Supreme Lord Mirage made the warrior immediately stilled and stunned. The other martial artists in the hall quickly stood up and cupped their hands together in greetings. Supreme Lord Mirage, the warrior cried, startled. He seemed to realize that he had done something wrong, but still reported, "These two little thieves snuck into here, and I am now sending them away for you." Being gripped by the warrior, Brent found that he was unable to revolve his life vitality. His face was full of gloom, but as soon as he heard the warrior call the person who came right in time before they were sent back, Supreme Lord, in awe, he too was shocked. However, his eyes flashed when he looked up and laughed. I've seen you before. You have been to the Cloud Hall. Brent, don't be rude. You must greet the Supreme Lord. Xander knew that a Supreme Lord was the peak existence in the universe, a great figure they could not even take a glance at. Brent might look much more mature than before, but his natural disposition was still hard to change. He still had that jerky smile on his face. He had indeed seen Supreme Lord Mirage before. Back in the days when all the warriors in the central region gathered at the Cloud Hall, they encountered an invasion from the sorcerer race. It was at that time that Supreme Lord Mirage had made a move in the Cloud Hall. Supreme Lord Mirage stared at the warrior who made the fuss. With a casual grab of him, Brent felt an invisible force pull him over as he found himself standing firmly on his feet. Then, Supreme Lord Mirage politely said to Xander, I am truly sorry. This time, there are too many guests that sometimes there are some unavoidable omissions. I hope you Shi clan can forgive us. Witnessing Supreme Lord Mirage's attitude, the world lords around were all stunned. Supreme Lord Mirage was actually being so courteous towards the two life and death realm warriors. They couldn't believe their eyes. What was the Shi clan? They had heard of the Xuanyuan clan, the Ji clan where Lucille came from, and another Ji clan where Janet came from. But they never heard of the Shi clan. Some people though were quick to analyze things. Wasn't it that the woman Zen would marry today had a surname Shi? These two were the guests from the bride's family. After expressing his apology, Supreme Lord Mirage reached out his hand and grabbed the rude martial artist. He copied what the martial artist had done moments ago and actually used the grand teleportation to throw him into the space crack. It was just that the distance Supreme Lord Mirage's grand teleportation covered would be countless times greater than what the warrior could achieve. He had directly thrown the martial artist out of the breaking cloud world. Brent and Xander were then led to sit at the very front of the square together with the group of Supreme Lords. Brent went completely obedient after being seated. Although he was filled with curiosity about his surroundings, he still felt great pressure from the aura faintly emitted by the Supreme Lords. Not long after, he finally figured out what the 10 pillars were used for. A series of thunderous dragon roars soon bellowed from the sky as 10 dragons hovered in the sky. The 9 genuine dragons were once capable of transforming into human shapes, but having heavenly bodies made it difficult for them to transform into other forms. The ancestral dragon, although had gained intelligence but was still unable to transform into other forms, so it could only maintain its original form. The 10 dragons roared and coiled themselves around the pillars with their own different gestures.